Have you ever made one bad decision on a terrible day, only to realize later it wasn't just a decision, it was a turning point in someone else's life? Picture this. Rain comes down so hard it turns streetlights into blurry halos. The kind of night when even confident people walk faster, shoulders tight, eyes down, as if the sky itself is angry. Now imagine being a kid in that rain, with no coat, no umbrella, and no safe place you can name. Before you judge anyone in this story, ask yourself a question and answer it honestly in your head. If you were exhausted, broke, and scared of getting cheated, would you still do the right thing for a stranger? Frank Hargreaves had been driving a taxi in Birmingham long enough to know every mood of the city. He knew the shift in the air when football had just ended and crowds spilled out loud and careless. He knew the quiet hours when the roads belonged to delivery vans and tired nurses. He knew, too, the kind of rain that didn't just wet you, but soaked through your skin and left you feeling punished. That night, he was on his 10th hour. His back ached. His eyes felt gritty. His patience had thinned to a thread. He had started the day with a phone call from his landlord and ended it with the warning light on the dashboard that refused to disappear. In between, he'd been shouted at by a passenger who accused him of taking the long way, even though he'd tried to avoid a closed road. He'd watched another driver take a fare he'd been waiting for. He'd eaten a lukewarm pasty in his car, crumbs dropping into the seat creases he never had time to clean properly. And when his phone buzzed with a message from his daughter Ellie, asking if he could help with her school trip payment, he'd stared at the screen too long before replying because he didn't want to type the words he was afraid were becoming his whole life. Not this week. Frank told himself he wasn't a bad man. He wasn't cruel. He didn't wake up wanting to hurt anyone. He just felt trapped, like life had tightened around him one bill at a time, one disappointment at a time, until the only thing he could control was whether he accepted a passenger or not. At around 9 in the evening, he pulled into a lay-by near a parade of shops on Bristol Road, engine idling, wipers swiping back and forth like nervous hands. He checked the time and did the kind of maths he always did at night. The maths that didn't add up no matter how many times you tried. If he stayed out another 2 hours, maybe he could cover the fuel and still take something home. If he got one airport run, he'd be fine. If he didn't, he'd be choosing between heating and groceries again. He hated that a grown man could work this hard and still feel like he was losing. That was when he saw her. She stood under the small shelter near the curb, half hidden behind the bus stop glass, a slim black girl, maybe 12 or 13, with tight curls plastered to her forehead by rain. Her hoodie was too thin and too big, sleeves pulled over her hands, water dripped from her chin. She wasn't laughing with friends. She wasn't scrolling on a phone. She was staring down the road with the stillness of someone trying not to panic in public. Frank's first thought was not kindness. His first thought was suspicion, because that's what fear does to you. He'd heard stories from other drivers about fake emergencies and passengers who jumped out without paying. He'd been burned once himself by a man who claimed he'd just nip inside to fetch cash and never returned. It had taken Frank hours to earn back that lost fare. He watched the girl glance toward his taxi, then away again. She looked like she was arguing with herself. Then she stepped forward. Frank's window was halfway down. Rain speckled the inside of the door. The girl leaned in just enough for him to hear her voice over the hiss of tires on wet tarmac. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was polite, but it trembled. "Can you take me to Kings Norton, please?" Frank's eyes flicked to her face, then to the empty street behind her. "You got money?" he asked, not bothering to soften it. He hated himself for how sharp he sounded, but he was tired, and his brain had stopped filtering. She swallowed. "I can pay," she said quickly. "I have some." "Not all." She lifted her palm to show a few coins and a folded note that looked damp around the edges. "My mom, My mom's at work. She said to get home, but my phone died. And the bus, Frank cut in. How much is some? Her eyes widened a fraction. I don't know the fare, she admitted, but I can give you what I have now. And when I get home, I can get the rest. My auntie's there. It was a reasonable answer for a child. It was also, to Frank's exhausted mind, a risk. He looked at her clothes again. He saw the soaked hoodie and the cheap trainers that were splitting at the side. He saw the way she shivered hard enough that her teeth might have been chattering. He should have seen what that meant. He should have recognized it as the kind of need that doesn't come with a clever plan. Instead, he felt something harder rise up, an old bitterness that whispered, "You're not a charity." "I can't do that," he said. "I'm working. This is how I feed my kid." The girl flinched as if he'd slapped the air. "I'm not asking for free," she said quickly, voice cracking. Please, I'm not safe here. I'm trying to get home." Frank glanced at the street again. In his head, he saw tomorrow's bills. He saw the fuel gauge. He saw the warning light. He saw every time someone had taken advantage of him, and he lumped this frightened child into the same category because it was easier than admitting the truth, which was that he could help her, and he was choosing not to. "Get a bus," he said. "There isn't one," she replied. "Not now." They stopped. I waited. He tapped the steering wheel, irritation flaring. "Look, I'm sorry, but I'm not driving anyone without payment up front. That's it." The girl's shoulders sagged. She stared down at the coins in her palm as if they'd betrayed her. Then she looked back up, and her eyes had that particular shine of someone forcing tears back because they know crying in public makes adults treat them like a nuisance. "Please," she said again, softer, "just to the next main road. Somewhere, with lights." Frank opened his mouth to say no, and something in his tone sharpened into cruelty because he was trying to end the conversation quickly. "I said no," he snapped. "Move away from the car." For a second, she didn't move. She looked at him like she couldn't understand how a grown man could see her shaking in the rain and still be more worried about a few pounds than her safety. Then she stepped back. Frank rolled the window up. The sound of the glass rising felt final, like a door closing in a hallway that suddenly seemed too long. He put the car in gear and pulled away, tires cutting through a puddle that sprayed water toward the curb. He did not look in the mirror because some part of him knew he would see her still standing there. And if he saw it clearly, he might have to face what he'd done. 2 minutes later, at a red light, his phone buzzed again. A message from Ellie. "Dad, are you coming home tonight? I can't sleep." Frank stared at the words until they blurred, rain and guilt mixing in his eyes. His throat tightened. He typed, "Soon," and sent it. Then, without thinking, he glanced at the rearview mirror. The bus stop was far behind now, but he could still make out a small shape, alone under the shelter, swallowed by the weather. He told himself she would be fine. Someone else would help. Someone kinder, someone less tired, someone with more money in their pocket and more patience in their heart. But the city does not hand out safety like that, and children do not magically become fine because adults decide they don't have time. That night, the rain kept falling, and Frank drove on, trying to outrun a feeling that clung to him anyway, heavy as wet clothing. He didn't know the girl's name. He didn't know her story. He didn't know that years later, on a different night, with a different kind of desperation, he would stand at the edge of a road, needing a ride more than pride, and the only car that stopped would carry the face he had once turned away. The worst part of that night was not that Frank drove away. The worst part was that he drove away without ever learning her name, which meant that in his mind, she could stay as a shadowy girl at the bus stop, instead of becoming what she truly was. A child with a home address, a mother waiting, and a fear that had nowhere to go once the taxi lights disappeared into the rain. The moment his car pulled off, the wind seemed to get louder. The shelter did almost nothing against the sideways rain, and the cold pushed through the thin fabric of the girl's hoodie as if it were paper. She stepped back under the glass panel and pressed her forehead against it for a second, not because it helped, but because the pressure gave her something to focus on besides the panic rising in her chest. Her name was Aaliyah Mensa, and she was 12 years old. She had been at a free homework club held in a community room above a charity shop, the sort of place run by volunteers who believed hot chocolate and steady encouragement could change a week that felt too heavy. Her mom, Nadine, worked long shifts and took every hour she could at the hospital because bills did not care about grief or exhaustion, and Aaliyah had learned early not to add worry to an adult who already carried too much. So she had promised she would get home on the bus, just like she always did. And she had believed it. Then the club ran late because one younger boy refused to leave until someone helped him finish a reading exercise, and Aaliyah stayed because she could not stand the look on his face when he thought he had failed. By the time she ran to the stop, her phone was nearly dead. She had checked the timetable anyway, squinting at wet ink and blurred numbers, and she had waited, telling herself that being responsible meant not making a fuss. When the bus did not come, she waited longer. When her phone finally died, she told herself that adults always said, "If you get stuck, call," as if a dead battery cared about their advice. She used the last of her courage to ask 3 strangers for help. One pretended not to hear. One said, "Not my problem," without meeting her eyes. One told her vaguely to walk toward Selly Oak, you'll find something, as if night and rain were minor inconveniences. By the time she saw Frank's taxi idle nearby, she felt a surge of relief so strong it almost made her dizzy. A taxi meant warmth. A taxi meant a door that locked. A taxi meant the adult inside had a job that included taking people home. And then the window went up and the taxi left, and her relief curdled into a humiliation that stung hotter than the cold. Aaliyah looked down at the coins in her palm. They felt ridiculous now, as if she had brought pebbles to purchase safety. She shoved them back into her pocket and took a slow breath, copying something her mom had taught her when she was younger, and frightened. Breathe in for 4, hold for 4, breathe out for 4. It did not solve the problem, but it stopped her from breaking apart. She made a decision that felt too big for her age. She would not stay at the bus stop. Staying still meant waiting for whatever might come along, and the street was quieter now, the traffic thinning, the gaps between passing cars stretching longer. Moving meant risk, but it also meant control, and Aaliyah needed to feel she had some control over anything. She pulled her hood tighter and began to walk. The pavement glistened under streetlights, and every few steps, her trainers splashed into shallow puddles that soaked her socks. She kept her head up, just like the volunteers had told all the kids at the homework club, and she tried to look like she knew exactly where she was going. She repeated her address in her mind as if it were a spell. She stayed near the brighter parts of the road, away from alleys, away from shadows that seemed to deepen whenever she glanced at them. After 10 minutes, her hands were numb and her stomach cramped with fear. She passed a closed takeaway with its metal shutter pulled down, then an off license that still had lights on behind the glass. That is where she stopped. She stood outside for a moment, hesitating, fighting the shame of needing help. Then she pushed the door open. Warm air hit her face. The tiny bell above the door rang, and a man behind the counter looked up. He was older, gray at the temples, wearing a cardigan and a tired expression that softened the instant he saw a soaked child standing in his shop. "Love, where's your mom?" he asked, not accusing, not suspicious, just concerned. Aaliyah's throat tightened. She tried to speak and found her voice wobbling. "She's at work," she managed. "My phone died. The bus didn't come. I tried to get a taxi, but he wouldn't take me. I'm just trying to get home." The man's eyes narrowed. Not at her, but at the idea of someone leaving a child like this. "Come here," he said gently. "Stand by the heater before you catch your death." "What's your name?" "Aaliyah," she whispered. "I'm Mr. Singh," he said, coming around the counter with a roll of paper towels. "Sit, dry your hands. Tell me your mom's name and where she works, and we'll ring someone, all right? We're not having you walking about in this weather." Aaliyah's shoulders sagged with relief, so sudden it felt like weakness. She sat on a small plastic stool near the heater, hands shaking as she accepted the towels. When Mr. Singh placed a cup of tea in front of her, she stared at it like it was a miracle. "My mom's Nadine," she said, swallowing hard. "She's a nurse, Queen Elizabeth Hospital. She'll be worried." Mr. Singh nodded, already reaching for the phone behind the counter. "She will be, and she has every right," he said. "But you're safe now. That's what matters." When he got through to the hospital switchboard, the wait felt endless. Aaliyah picked at the edge of a napkin, eyes fixed on the steam rising from the cup. She kept replaying Frank's face, his flat refusal, the way his words had sounded like a door slammed shut. Part of her wanted to forget it immediately, to wipe it from her mind like rain from glass. Another part, deeper and sharper, recorded it with perfect clarity, because she had learned something that night that no child should have to learn. She had learned that some adults looked at her and saw a risk before they saw her fear. When Nadine finally came on the line, her voice was strained and fast, the voice of a mother trying not to fall apart. "Aaliyah, where are you? Are you hurt?" "I'm okay," Aaliyah said quickly, tears finally spilling because she could not hold them back anymore. "I'm in a shop. Mr. Singh is here. I tried to get home, but—" "I'm coming," Nadine cut in. "Stay exactly where you are. Do not go outside. Do you hear me? I'm coming." The next 20 minutes crawled. Mr. Singh kept talking gently, asking Aaliyah about school, about her homework club, about what she liked to read, anything to keep her present. He did not ask why she had been out so late in a way that blamed her. He spoke as if the world had made a mistake, and he was simply correcting it. When Nadine burst through the door, still in her uniform trousers and a borrowed coat, her face wet with rain and something else, she crossed the shop in 3 strides and wrapped Aaliyah in her arms so tightly Aaliyah could barely breathe. Nadine's hands trembled as she held her, as if her body had only just realized how close it had come to losing her. "I'm sorry," Aaliyah sobbed, even though she had done nothing wrong. "I'm sorry." Nadine pulled back and looked at her daughter's face, checking for injuries with a nurse's trained eyes and a mother's frantic heart. "Don't you apologize," she said, voice shaking with anger, aimed at the world, not at the child in front of her. "You did exactly what you should. You asked for help. You went somewhere with lights. You stayed visible. I am proud of you." Mr. Singh cleared his throat awkwardly, as if embarrassed by being part of such a private moment. "She came in here soaked through," he said. "A good kid. Very brave." Nadine turned to him, and her eyes filled again. "Thank you," she said, and the gratitude in her voice sounded like something that came from the bottom of a person. "You have no idea what you've done." He waved it off, but his expression softened. "I do," he said quietly. "I have daughters too." On the drive home, Aaliyah sat in the passenger seat of Nadine's battered car, wrapped in a spare blanket. The heater rattled, and the windscreen fogged at the edges. Nadine's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "Tell me about the taxi," Nadine said after a few minutes, voice controlled but tight. Aaliyah hesitated, then described it, word by word. She described the question about money. She described the window rising. She described the way the car pulled away. Nadine listened without interrupting, jaw working as if she were chewing her rage down to something she could manage. "Did you get the number?" Nadine asked. Aaliyah's stomach sank. "No," she whispered. "I didn't think. It happened so fast." Nadine exhaled, long and slow. "It's all right," she said, though her voice carried disappointment, not in Aaliyah, but in a world that demanded evidence before it believed a child. "It's all right. You're home." They reached their flat, and Nadine ushered Aaliyah inside, stripped off her wet hoodie, and wrapped her in warmth and soup and stern instructions about charging her phone and carrying a portable battery if she could afford one. Later, when Aaliyah lay in bed, clean and dry, she stared at the ceiling and listened to her mother moving around the kitchen, too wired to sleep. Aaliyah made another decision in the dark. One day, she would never be the kind of adult who rolled a window up on a child in trouble. One day, she would be the person who stopped. The person who asked, "Are you safe?" before asking, "Can you pay?" And somewhere across the city, Frank Hargreaves lay on his own sofa, television on mute, Ellie's school trip letter on the table, guilt sitting in his chest like a heavy stone. He told himself again that the girl would have found a way home, that the world had other good people in it. He did not yet understand that "someone else will help" is the excuse that makes a cold night colder, and that years later, when he needed help himself, he would meet the consequences of that excuse in the most unexpected way. 10 years can change a city without changing its landmarks. The same roads still curve around the same parks. The same red buses still sigh at the same stops. And the same rain still arrives with the confidence of something that knows it belongs in Birmingham. Yet, for Aaliyah Mensah, the distance between 12 and 22 felt like an entire lifetime, not because time had been gentle, but because it had taught her exactly what she could become if she refused to let one cruel moment define her. She never forgot that night at the bus stop. It did not sit in her memory like a dramatic scene with swelling music. It sat there like a small, sharp pebble in a shoe, something you could ignore for a while, until the day you realized you had been limping for years. At first, she tried to forget Frank's face. She tried to blur it, the way you blur an unpleasant smell by opening a window and pretending fresh air is enough. But her mind refused to let it go, because it was not only about him. It was about the lesson his decision delivered to a child who had been trying her best. That safety could be treated like a privilege instead of a basic human need. Aaliyah grew up fast after that. Not in the dramatic, glamorous way people sometimes romanticize when they speak about strong girls. She grew up in the quiet way that happens in homes where a single parent works long shifts, where electricity bills dictate choices, where you learn to read your mother's face the moment she steps through the door to decide whether today is a day for laughter or for silence. Nadine loved her fiercely, but love did not erase exhaustion. Some evenings, her mom fell asleep at the kitchen table with her shoes still on. Some mornings, she moved like her body belonged to someone else, pouring cereal with a hand that trembled from too little rest. Aaliyah learned to be helpful without being asked. She charged her phone religiously, saved every spare pound, and carried a portable battery once she could afford one. She planned routes in advance, memorized timetables, and avoided taking risks that might put her in the position of begging a stranger for help again. Her world became organized around one central mission: never be powerless in public. At school, she became the girl teachers leaned on, responsible, calm, reliable, the type who volunteered to tidy after events, who helped younger pupils find classrooms, who stayed behind to stack chairs without ever rolling her eyes. Adults praised her maturity, but they did not see the anxiety underneath it. The way her stomach tightened whenever she saw someone stranded in the rain, the way she watched bus stops at dusk as if they were places where childhood could be stolen. And then, one afternoon when she was 16, she did something that changed her direction. She was walking home from school and saw a little boy standing outside a small shop, crying quietly into his sleeve. He had a backpack too big for him and a look of panic that made Aaliyah's chest tighten. She could have kept walking the way people did. She could have told herself, It was none of her business. Instead, she stopped. "Are you okay?" she asked, keeping her voice soft. "Have you lost someone?" The boy looked up, eyes wide with relief and fear. "My Nan," he sniffed. "She went inside and I can't find her." Aaliyah didn't panic. She didn't lecture him. She didn't ask why he'd been careless. She did the simplest thing in the world, the thing that had been denied to her when she needed it. She stayed with him until the adult returned. When his Nan burst out of the shop, frantic and apologizing, Aaliyah smiled and said, "He was scared. You might want to hold his hand next time." That night, in bed, she stared at the ceiling and realized something that felt like a door unlocking. She could not rewrite what happened to her at 12, but she could decide what kind of person she would become because of it. She could become someone who stopped. That decision followed her into adulthood. When she finished school, she considered nursing like her mom, but Nadine's tired eyes and aching back made Aaliyah hesitate. She wanted a job where she could work hard without being swallowed whole. She tried retail for a while, then admin. Neither fit. The days felt like they belonged to someone else. She wanted movement, independence, the feeling of being useful in a direct way. A friend mentioned driving for a ride-hail company while studying part-time, and the idea lodged in Aaliyah's head like a spark that refused to go out. She already liked driving. She liked the logic of roads. She liked the quiet control of a steering wheel in her hands. More than that, she liked the thought of being the person who could say yes when someone needed to get home. At 21, after saving and borrowing and working extra hours, she got her private hire license and began driving. Her first weeks were messy, awkward, exhausting. She took wrong turns. She misjudged distances. She got 1-star ratings from passengers who expected perfection from a young woman because they mistook youth for incompetence. She dealt with men who tried to flirt too aggressively, who sat too close, who made jokes that weren't jokes at all. She learned to set boundaries with a calm firmness that left no room for argument. She installed a dash cam, shared her live location with her mom, and built habits that kept her safe. And yet, even on the hard nights, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. Because she became known for something. Other drivers knew her as the one who didn't leave people behind if she could help it. Not foolishly, not recklessly. She wasn't naive. She knew she needed to protect herself, and she followed the rules. But within those rules, she made room for humanity. She kept a spare umbrella in her boot. She carried a small pack of tissues. She kept bottled water for passengers who looked shaken. She learned which hospitals had the most confusing entrances and which care homes had the kindest receptionists. Sometimes she gave rides to women who were shaking after a bad date, eyes glued to the window as if expecting someone to follow. Sometimes she drove exhausted nurses, their heads nodding as soon as they hit the back seat, and she turned the radio down so they could rest. Sometimes she carried teenagers who pretended they didn't need help, shoulders stiff and chin high, and she remembered the 12-year-old version of herself and made sure she got them where they needed to go, without adding shame to their night. Nadine worried about her, of course. "Be careful," she would say every time Aaliyah grabbed her keys. "The world isn't kind just because you are." Aaliyah would kiss her mom's cheek and answer, "That's why I do it, because it isn't." By 22, she had a routine that worked. She drove mostly evenings, studied during the day, saved for a future that felt possible. She didn't think about the taxi driver from that rainy night often anymore, not in detail. The memory had softened around the edges, less a wound and more a reminder. Be the person you needed when you were small. Then came the night that turned the story back on itself. It was late autumn again, the kind of cold that sneaks under collars. Rain was falling, not violently, but steadily enough to soak you if you underestimated it. Aaliyah had just dropped off a passenger near the city center and was considering calling it a night when her phone buzzed with a request that flashed up with a short distance and a pickup point near a quieter road. She hesitated. That area wasn't the worst, but it wasn't the easiest either. Still, the fare was short, the rating looked fine, and she told herself not to build fear into a habit. She accepted. As she drove toward the pin, headlights sweeping over wet tarmac, she saw a figure standing near the curb, shoulders hunched. The street was dim. The person lifted a hand slightly, not waving like someone confident, but signaling like someone uncertain whether they were allowed to ask for anything. Aaliyah slowed and pulled up, keeping the doors locked as she always did until she confirmed the name. She lowered the window a few inches. "Hi," she said. "Who are you picking up for?" The figure stepped closer into the light, and Aaliyah felt her stomach tighten for an entirely different reason. It was a man in his late 50s, face lined by time and stress, hair thinning at the crown, cheeks slightly hollow. He looked like someone who had spent years sitting behind a steering wheel. His coat was cheap and wet. His hands shook as he held up a phone with a cracked screen. He squinted at her and read the name on the ride request. "Aaliyah," he said, voice rough. That's the driver." "Right. Yes," she replied carefully. "And you are." He swallowed, eyes darting as if he expected the world to punish him for answering. "Frank," he said. "Frank Hargreaves." The name hit her like a note played too loud. Aaliyah stared at him, the rain tapping against the roof of her car, the wipers moving with steady patience. For a moment, she wasn't 22. She was 12 again, soaked, shivering, coins in her pocket, begging through a half-open window. Frank peered at her face, trying to place it, then gave a small, confused frown. "You all right?" he asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Aaliyah's heart pounded, but her voice stayed calm. "I'm fine," she said, though she wasn't sure if it was true. "Get in. Back seat, please." He hesitated. "You want payment up front?" he said quickly, almost automatically, as if he'd been trained by embarrassment. I can show you. I've got it. I've got my card linked. It'll go through. I just need to get to—" Aaliyah's hands tightened on the wheel. There it was. The fear of being thrown back into the rain. The fear of being told no. The fear of being treated like a problem when all you needed was a ride. "You're already booked," she said evenly. "Just get in." Frank opened the back door and slid inside, dripping water onto the mat, breathing hard as if the effort of standing had cost him. He smelled faintly of damp and engine oil. When the door closed, the car suddenly felt too small for the moment that was about to unfold. Aaliyah pulled away from the curb and merged onto the road, eyes fixed ahead. She didn't trust herself to look at him in the mirror for more than a second. She could feel his exhaustion like a presence, and she could also feel something else. The weight of time, the possibility that the universe had arranged this meeting not for revenge, but for a choice. Frank cleared his throat. "Thanks," he said after a minute. "I've had a rough day. My car's off the road, and my phone, well, everything's a mess." Aaliyah said nothing yet. She needed to hear him breathe for a while, needed to make sure her voice, when it came, would not shake. Rain blurred the streetlights into long golden streaks, and the car moved through them like a quiet vessel carrying a moment that would decide what kind of person Aaliyah truly was, now that power sat in her hands. Because this time, she wasn't the child at the bus stop. This time, she was the driver. Aaliyah kept both hands on the steering wheel and drove as if the road demanded her full attention. Because if she let her mind wander even slightly, it would swing back to that bus stop, like a door slamming in the wind. She could feel Frank behind her without looking, the way you can feel someone's nervousness in a small space. His breathing was uneven, the kind that comes from trying to stay calm when your body has already decided it is scared. In the rearview mirror, she finally let herself glance at him. He was staring out of the window, jaw clenched. as if watching the rain slide down the glass would stop it sliding down his life. He looked older than she expected, but not simply older in years. He looked worn down, the way people look when they have been losing in small increments for too long. "You okay back there?" she asked, and her voice came out steadier than her heart. Frank blinked, as if he'd forgotten there was another person in the car. "Yeah," he said quickly. "Yeah, I'm fine. Sorry, I'm soaked. Didn't mean to mess up your car." "It's just water," Aaliyah replied. "Where are you headed?" He hesitated, and that hesitation told her more than the answer itself. "Queen Elizabeth Hospital," he said finally, the words dropping like stones. "I need to get there fast." The hospital name tightened her chest for a different reason now. It wasn't just a location. It was a memory of her mom's uniform, of long shifts, of the smell of antiseptic clinging to clothing, of the kind of tired that made adults look through you because their brains were still on duty even when their bodies had come home. "What's happened?" she asked, and immediately regretted it, because she didn't want his story to soften her too quickly, and she didn't want her own bitterness to harden her into someone she hated. Frank rubbed a hand over his face. "It's my daughter," he said. "Ellie. She's in A&E. They called me." He swallowed, throat working. "Her mom's out of the picture. It's just me and her." Aaliyah felt the road tilt slightly under her, not literally, but emotionally, like a balance shifting. She pictured a girl waiting in a hospital bay, bright lights overhead, a plastic bracelet on her wrist, fear trying to act like bravery. She had no reason to doubt him because panic carried its own tone, and he had it. "Is she okay?" Aaliyah asked. "I don't know," Frank admitted, and the honesty in that sentence sounded like it hurt him. "They said she collapsed at work. She's 19. She's never." He stopped, as if speaking the possibilities aloud would invite them in. "I can't get there on my own. My car broke down earlier, the taxi's off the road, and I don't have anyone to call." Aaliyah's hands tightened on the wheel again. The universe had a cruel sense of symmetry, she thought. One rainy night, a child asked him for a ride home, and he had decided she was not worth the risk. Now, on another wet night, he was asking the world for a ride to someone he loved, and the world had left him standing at a curb. She kept driving. The city slid past in damp streaks. Wiper blades moved in steady arcs. Headlights smeared across puddles. Aaliyah's mind argued with itself in two voices. One voice said, "This is your moment. Make him feel it. Let him sit in the fear he gave you." The other voice said, "You promised yourself you would not become the kind of adult who uses power to punish someone weaker in the moment." Frank cleared his throat again. "You're quick," he said, trying to fill the silence, trying to bargain with small talk. Most drivers take ages in this weather. Aaliyah gave a non-committal hum. He leaned forward slightly, cautious. "Can I ask, what's your name again?" It said it on the app, but I didn't want to get it wrong. She felt her pulse in her fingertips. "Aaliyah," she said. Frank repeated it quietly, as if tasting the sound. "Nice name," he said. And then, after a beat, "You from around here?" "Yeah," she replied. "Born and raised." He nodded to himself, still trying to place her. "You look familiar," he said, frowning. "Have I picked you up before? Or maybe I used to drive you when you were younger. I was a taxi driver for years." Aaliyah's mouth went dry. Her brain flashed a picture she had kept filed away. A taxi light glowing through rain, a window half open, a man's tired eyes, his voice sharp with impatience. She could have let him keep guessing. She could have let the recognition grow slowly, like a bruise darkening with time. Instead, she chose truth. "You probably don't remember me," she said, and her voice stayed calm only because she forced it to. "But I remember you." Frank's face tightened, and she saw the moment a person realizes their past has found them. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he already knew. Aaliyah took a breath. 10 years ago, she said. I was 12. It was raining like this. My phone died. The bus didn't come. I asked a taxi driver for help to get home. Frank stared at her through the mirror. His eyes widened slightly, then narrowed, scanning her features with a sudden, awful focus. No, he whispered. Aaliyah kept her eyes on the road. You asked me if I had money, she continued, each sentence precise, not dramatic, because she didn't need drama. I said I had some, but not all. I asked you to take me somewhere safer, somewhere with lights. You told me to move away from the car and rolled the window up. Frank's mouth opened, then closed. His face had gone pale under the streetlight flicker. That was you, he said, and it wasn't a question. It was a verdict. Aaliyah felt heat rise behind her eyes, anger that had been stored for a decade finally warming into words. I walked in the rain until I found a shopkeeper who helped me, she said. I got home, but I never forgot how it felt when you decided I wasn't worth 10 minutes of your time. Frank's hands shook. He looked down at his own knees as if he couldn't bear to look at the mirror anymore. I'm sorry, he said quickly. I swear to you, I'm sorry. I was. He stopped himself, because he realized excuses were insults dressed up as explanations. Aaliyah's voice sharpened anyway. Were you what? She asked. Tired? Broke? Fed up? Because I was a child. Soaked through. Standing alone. Frank's shoulders slumped. Yes, he said, and the word came out like surrender. I was tired. I was broke. I was angry at everyone. And I took it out on the first person who asked me for help. I did a cruel thing to a kid because I was thinking about myself. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. I've thought about that night more times than I can count. Aaliyah's heart stuttered. You have? She asked, and she hated the small hope that tried to sneak into her tone because she didn't want to be softened by regret. Frank nodded, still not meeting her eyes. I didn't know what happened to you, he said. I told myself someone else would help. I told myself you'd be fine. But it didn't feel fine, even when I said it. It felt like I'd left part of my decency at that bus stop. He breathed out hard. I went home and my daughter asked if I was coming in, and I couldn't answer properly because I kept picturing you out there in the rain. I didn't know your name. I didn't know your face would show up again like this. Aaliyah's grip loosened by a fraction. She didn't want to forgive him quickly. She didn't want to let the story become a neat little bow where one apology erased a decade of consequences. But she also didn't want to be trapped in that night forever, because she had built her whole adult self around not being trapped. They drove in silence for a moment. The hospital signs appeared ahead, luminous and unmissable. Aaliyah's chest tightened as she turned into the approach lane, where cars crawled and brake lights glowed red like warning signals. Frank leaned forward. If you want to drop me and go, he said hoarsely, I'll understand. I don't deserve your help. But please, if you can, just get me close. I need to see my girl. Aaliyah stopped the car at the nearest safe point, hazard lights blinking, rain tapping gently on the roof like fingers counting time. She turned slightly in her seat, not fully facing him, because her emotions still felt too exposed. Here's what's going to happen, she said. You're going inside. You're going to focus on your daughter. You're not going to carry this moment like a weapon or a sob story. And later, when things settle, you and I can talk, if you still want to apologize. Frank's eyes shone, and he nodded quickly. Yes, he whispered. Yes, thank you. Aaliyah opened her phone and canceled the ride the proper way, so he wouldn't be charged extra. Then she surprised herself by doing one more thing. She reached into her glove compartment and pulled out a small pack of tissues she kept for passengers who were crying but pretending they weren't. She handed it back without a speech. Frank took it like it weighed something. You're a better person than I was, he said. Aaliyah swallowed. I'm trying, she replied. That's all. Frank got out, rain immediately soaking his shoulders again. Before he shut the door, he paused and looked back at her with a helpless, childlike honesty. "Aaliyah," he said, voice breaking, "if Ellie is okay, if I get a chance to make things right somehow, I will." Aaliyah held his gaze for a second, then nodded once. "We'll see," she said. He ran toward the entrance, hunched against the weather, and disappeared through the sliding doors into bright hospital light. Aaliyah sat in the car for a long moment, with the wipers still moving, heart racing, palms damp, feeling the strange aftershock of power used differently than she'd once dreamed. She had imagined revenge as something satisfying. Instead, it felt heavy, unnecessary, almost childish. What she had done wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it also wasn't punishment. It was something harder, choosing not to become the storm that had soaked her. And as she pulled away from the hospital, her phone buzzed with another ride request. Aaliyah stared at the screen, then at the rain, and realized that tonight wasn't finished with either of them. Aaliyah accepted the next ride request without really thinking, because driving had trained her body to move before her mind finished processing. The screen pinged, the map drew a line, and her hands did what they always did. Indicator, turn, steady speed, scan, mirrors. Yet the moment she pulled away from the hospital entrance, the inside of her chest felt louder than the rain. She told herself she had done the right thing. She had got him there. She had not abandoned a frightened parent in the weather the way he had abandoned a frightened child. She had chosen to break a pattern instead of completing it. And still, her hands trembled slightly on the wheel. The next pickup was only 5 minutes away, outside a small block of flats near a main road. A young woman climbed into the back seat, soaked hair clinging to her cheeks, mascara smudged, voice tight with embarrassment. "Sorry," the woman blurted before Aaliyah could even greet her. "I'm fine. It's just, everything's been a lot." Aaliyah glanced at her in the mirror. "No need to apologize," she said softly. "Where are we going?" As the car moved, the woman talked in bursts, an argument with her boyfriend. A door slammed, a phone thrown on the sofa, the decision to leave before things got worse. Aaliyah listened with the steady attention she had once prayed an adult would offer her at 12. She didn't interrupt. She didn't preach. She didn't ask why the woman stayed so long. She simply drove the way a seatbelt holds you, without judgment. When the ride ended and the woman stepped out under the awning of a lit building, she paused and looked back. "Thank you," she said, voice thick, "for not making it weird." Aaliyah nodded once. "Get inside," she replied. "Text someone you trust." The woman smiled weakly and disappeared into the lobby. Aaliyah sat in the quiet for a moment after watching the rain smear the streetlights. It struck her then how often people climbed into her car carrying invisible storms. How often a safe ride was the thin line between coping and breaking. The world was full of these moments, everywhere, happening quietly. It wasn't that she was special, it was that the need was constant. Her phone buzzed again, but this time she didn't accept immediately. She checked the time, then the hospital address still hovering in her recent locations, and felt her throat tighten. Without making a dramatic decision, she turned the car around and drove back toward the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. Not to interfere, not to chase a scene, but because something in her refused to leave that story unfinished in the dark. She parked farther down, in a place where she wouldn't block anyone, and waited. The rain kept coming, steady and stubborn, tapping at her roof with the patience of a memory. People moved in and out of the A&E entrance staff with tired faces, relatives clutching coats around themselves, patients stepping outside for air and then retreating quickly from the cold. Aaliyah watched them all with the quiet vigilance of someone who had once stood outside, hoping an adult would choose compassion. After nearly 40 minutes, the sliding doors opened and Frank stumbled out. He didn't walk like a man who had received good news. He didn't walk like a man who had received the worst news either. He walked like someone floating between outcomes, suspended in uncertainty. His shoulders were hunched, his hair darker with rain, and his face looked pinched, as if he'd been holding his breath for too long. Aaliyah's stomach tightened. She considered leaving, considered preserving the boundaries she'd set, but her body moved before the debate finished. She pulled up slowly near the curb, lowered the window a few inches, and spoke his name, Frank. He turned, startled, as if he'd assumed the world had moved on without him the moment he disappeared through those doors. When he saw her, something in his expression collapsed. "You came back," he said, voice rough. "I was nearby," Aaliyah replied, though they both knew it wasn't quite true. "How is she?" Frank dragged a hand over his face. "She's stable," he said, the word sounding like a lifeline he didn't quite trust. "They're keeping her in overnight. They think it might be a heart rhythm issue, or maybe dehydration and stress. But they're doing tests." She collapsed at her cafe job. She didn't tell me she'd been feeling faint. His eyes squeezed shut for a second. "I didn't know. I didn't see it." Aaliyah exhaled slowly, relief and sadness tangling together. "I'm glad she's stable," she said. Frank nodded, then looked down at his hands, as if ashamed of how much they shook. "I need to go home and get her things," he murmured. "Phone charger, clean clothes, her inhaler in case. I don't even know what I'm doing," he swallowed. "And then I need to come back. I can't leave her alone in there." Aaliyah hesitated. She wasn't a free taxi service, and she didn't want to blur the line between compassion and self-erasure. Yet her mind flashed to a 12-year-old Aaliyah walking in rain because a driver had decided his boundaries mattered more than her safety. "Where do you live?" she asked. Frank blinked. "Erdington," he said. "Not far, but buses." "I can take you," she said, before her courage could change its mind. "One trip there and back, and then we're even for the night." Frank stared at her, eyes shining. "No," he said quickly. "No, I can't. You've already done too much. I'll pay. I'll pay double. Aaliyah cut him off gently, because she had learned that some people would drown in guilt if you let them keep talking. "I'm driving," she said. "Get in." He climbed into the back seat again, with the careful, apologetic movements of a man who didn't feel entitled to anything. As Aaliyah pulled away, the silence between them felt different now, less sharp, still heavy, but no longer hostile. It was the silence of two people, carrying the same scene from different angles. Halfway onto the motorway, Frank spoke. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, voice quiet. "I don't even think I'm asking for it. But I need you to understand something." He paused, as if choosing each word like it might cut him. "That night with you, it didn't just vanish. I remembered it. Not every detail. I couldn't have picked you out of a crowd. But the feeling of it stuck." Aaliyah's jaw tightened. "Why didn't you do anything?" she asked. "If you remembered, why didn't you change?" Frank let out a breath that sounded like defeat. "I tried," he said. "In small ways. I gave a free ride here and there. I let someone pay later. I gave people the benefit of the doubt sometimes." He shook his head slightly. "But I also told myself that because nothing terrible happened to you, it didn't matter as much as it did. I used that as a way to avoid looking at the truth." His voice broke on the next part. "The truth is, I was lucky. You were lucky. That's all. I wasn't right. I was lucky." Aaliyah felt her throat tighten. Because she knew that truth so well, it almost felt like her own property. She didn't answer immediately. She focused on the road, the sheen of rain on asphalt, the rhythm of wipers, the steady hum of the engine. "You know what's messed up?" she said finally, voice low. "I built my whole life around not being that powerless again. I charge my phone like it's a religion. I carry batteries. I check routes. I plan. I do everything people say kids should do." She swallowed, and none of that changes what happened, because the point wasn't my preparation. The point was that I was a child, and an adult decided my fear was an inconvenience. Frank didn't argue. "You're right," he said simply. When they reached his flat, he asked her to wait while he ran inside. Aaliyah stayed in the car, engine on low, watching the yellow light in his window flicker as he moved around. 10 minutes later, he returned with a small bag and a paper envelope. He slid into the back seat, then leaned forward awkwardly, holding the envelope toward her. "What's that?" Aaliyah asked, eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Cash," Frank said, "for tonight, and more. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I can't." "No," Aaliyah interrupted. "Firmer now. Put it away." Frank froze, embarrassed. "Please," he whispered, "let me do something." Aaliyah's voice softened, but her boundary didn't move. "Money isn't what you owe," she said. "You owe attention. You owe decency. You owe the next kid in the rain a different answer than the one you gave me." Frank stared at her, as if she'd spoken in a language he understood but had never been taught to use. "Okay," he said, throat working. "Tell me how." Aaliyah hesitated, surprised by the sincerity. She thought of Mr. Singh, the shopkeeper, who had corrected the world's mistake with a cup of tea and a phone call. She thought of her mum, who had driven through rain with her heart in her hands. She thought of the way she'd been building her own little habits of care in her car. Tissues, water, an umbrella in the boot. "Start small," she said, "and start consistently. Stop telling yourself someone else will help. Be someone. Not for applause, not for a story, just because you can." Frank nodded slowly, as if committing it to memory. On the drive back to the hospital, he spoke again, quieter. "I haven't driven in months," he admitted. "Not properly. My taxi license expired when I got ill." He swallowed, as if the confession tasted bitter. "Diabetes complications. Lost feeling in my feet for a while. Couldn't risk it. I fell behind on bills, sold things, borrowed. Ellie picked up shifts to help." His voice cracked with shame. "My daughter's been holding me up, and I didn't even realize how much." Aaliyah felt a flicker of understanding, not excuse, not justification, but context. The same way her mum's exhaustion had never excused the world's neglect, yet still explained why Nadine sometimes snapped over small things. People got cornered, and when they did, they sometimes became smaller versions of themselves. At the hospital entrance, Frank got out again, clutching the bag like it might anchor him. He paused before closing the door. "Aaliyah," he said, voice trembling, "if Ellie wakes up properly and she's okay, I want to apologize to you in front of her, not to make it dramatic, but because I don't want her to grow up thinking it's normal to close windows on people. I don't want her to learn my worst habits." Aaliyah held his gaze. The rain shimmered on the glass between them. For a moment, she saw not a villain, but a flawed man standing at the edge of a lesson that could still be learned. "Don't perform it," she said quietly. "Live it. That's the apology that matters." Frank nodded. "I will," he whispered, and then he was gone again, through the sliding doors, swallowed by bright lights and uncertainty. Aaliyah sat in her car and felt her chest ache in a way that wasn't only anger anymore. She didn't call it forgiveness. It was too soon. It might never be neat. But she felt something shift. Because she had faced the man from the bus stop and chosen not to become him. She had kept her dignity. She had held her boundary. She had offered help without letting guilt buy her. And in doing so, she had proved to herself that the 12-year-old in the rain hadn't been abandoned by the world entirely. At least one adult had shown up for her. She had. Aaliyah did not go straight home after dropping Frank at the hospital. She told herself she would, but her hands kept circling the same roads as if the steering wheel had its own opinion. The rain had eased into a fine drizzle, the kind that makes the world look permanently half asleep, and the glow from the hospital signage turned the wet pavement into a ribbon of light. She parked again, farther back this time, where she could watch without feeling as though she was hovering. She waited longer than she meant to. It was nearly midnight when Frank finally came out again. This time he moved faster, though his shoulders were still hunched and his face still carried that strained tightness that comes from fear you cannot put down. He stopped near the curb and looked around, confused, as if he wasn't sure whether she would still be there or whether he had imagined the whole encounter in the first place. Aaliyah pulled forward and lowered the window. He exhaled so hard it looked like his chest might cave in. "She's awake," he said immediately. "Not fully herself, but awake. They've got her on a monitor. They say it's not looking like something catastrophic, but they're still checking. She's tired. That's what they keep saying. Exhausted." Aaliyah's throat tightened at the word, because exhaustion was always presented as harmless until it wasn't. "Can you see her?" she asked. Frank nodded. "They'll let me sit with her for a bit, but I needed air. I needed to, I don't know. I needed to breathe." He rubbed his face, then hesitated as if he were about to ask something he didn't deserve to ask. "Would you come in? Just for a minute. I want to introduce you to her. Not as a stunt. Just, I want her to meet the person who got me there." Aaliyah's first instinct was to refuse. Hospitals carried too many memories, and not all of them were hers. Hospitals were also places where people felt entitled to emotions they hadn't earned, where tears could become performances without anyone meaning them to. She didn't want to be pulled into someone else's family moment like a prop. Then she remembered being 12, sitting under a shop heater with a cup of tea she hadn't asked for, saved by a stranger who chose to make her fear his business. "Okay," she said quietly. "1 minute." Inside, A and E smelled like disinfectant and tiredness. The lights were too bright, the chairs too hard, the air too dry. Frank led her through a corridor with the careful urgency of someone afraid the opportunity might vanish if he moved too slowly. He stopped at a curtained bay and hesitated, hand hovering near the fabric, as if asking permission from the universe. "She's here," he whispered. He pulled the curtain back. Ellie lay propped up on a bed, hair pulled into a messy bun, face pale but alert. A monitor beeped steadily beside her, and a plastic bracelet circled her wrist. She looked older than 19 in the eyes, and younger than 19 in the way she tried to smile, as if everything was fine. Aaliyah saw, immediately, the shape of responsibility sitting on her like an oversized coat. "Dad," Ellie said, voice scratchy. "Where did you go? You're soaked." "I'm fine," Frank lied automatically, then caught himself and corrected it. "I'm not fine, but I'm here." He swallowed and stepped aside slightly. "Ellie, this is Aaliyah. She's the driver who brought me. She helped tonight." Ellie blinked at Aaliyah, then managed a small smile. "Thank you," she said, and the gratitude sounded real, not polite. He's useless with directions when he's panicking. Frank gave a shaky laugh that didn't quite disguise the emotion in his throat. "I heard that," he muttered. Aaliyah stepped closer, but didn't crowd the bed. "You're welcome," she said gently. "How are you feeling?" Ellie made a face. "Embarrassed," she admitted, "and tired. They keep asking if I've been eating properly, and I have, mostly. But I've been doing doubles at the cafe because we're short-staffed. And I didn't want to stress Dad out because he's been stressed anyway. And then I felt dizzy, and I thought it was nothing. And then it wasn't nothing." Aaliyah noticed the way Ellie said Dad, as if she were trying to protect him from the truth, even while she lay in a hospital bed. She understood that instinct. It was the instinct of kids who become adults too early. Kids who treat their own needs like luxuries. Frank sat on the edge of the chair beside the bed, hands clasped, eyes glossy. "You shouldn't have been carrying all that," he said, voice breaking. "I'm the parent." Ellie looked away, blinking hard. "I wasn't trying to be dramatic," she whispered. "I just didn't want you to worry." Frank's shoulders shook once, like a sob trying to escape and being pushed back down by pride. He leaned forward, careful of wires and tubes, and touched her hand as if he'd only just remembered he was allowed to. Aaliyah stood back, letting the moment be theirs. She told herself she would leave after a minute, like she promised. Then Frank turned his head and looked at Aaliyah with an expression that held equal parts shame and urgency. "Ellie," he said, voice hoarse, "there's something I need to say in front of you. Not to upset you, but because I don't want to hide it anymore." Ellie frowned slightly. "What?" Frank took a breath and forced the words out like they were stuck behind his ribs. "When Aaliyah was a kid," he said, "I did something cruel. Years ago. I was a taxi driver then. She asked me for help in the rain, and I refused. I left her there because I was thinking about money and myself. I didn't even know her name. Tonight, she picked me up when I needed to get to you." His voice cracked on the last word. "She didn't have to. She did." Ellie stared at him as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. Then she looked at Aaliyah, eyes searching. Aaliyah kept her voice steady. "It was a long time ago," she said, "and I got home that night. But I didn't forget how it felt." Ellie's expression changed, tightening with something like anger on Aaliyah's behalf. "Dad," she said, quiet and sharp, "why would you do that to a kid?" Frank bowed his head. "Because I was smaller than I should have been," he whispered. "I was tired and bitter, and I convinced myself it was safer to say no than to be decent." Ellie swallowed, then looked back at Aaliyah. "I'm sorry," she said, and her apology sounded like it came from the part of her that still believed adults should act better than they sometimes do. "I'm really sorry that happened to you." Aaliyah felt a surprising sting behind her eyes. She hadn't come for sympathy, and she didn't want the story to become a spectacle, but there was something about hearing a young woman say sorry without excuses that loosened a knot Aaliyah didn't know she'd been holding. "Thank you," Aaliyah replied softly. "I'm glad you're okay." Frank wiped his face with his sleeve, then looked at Aaliyah again, pleading without words. Aaliyah answered with the only boundary that still felt clean. "I'm going to go," she said. "You two need to focus on each other." Ellie nodded. "Thank you for coming in," she said, voice tired. "And thank you for not being like him." Frank flinched, but he didn't argue, which told Aaliyah he was finally learning. Ellie added, gentler, "I mean, thank you for being better than the worst moment." Aaliyah held that for a second, then gave a small nod and left the bay. In the corridor, Frank followed her out. He stopped a few steps away, not blocking her, not invading her space, just standing there like a man unsure what to do with remorse, now that it had nowhere left to hide. "I can't undo it," he said quietly. "No," Aaliyah agreed. "I want to do something," he tried again, voice strained. "Not money, not a speech, something real." Aaliyah thought for a moment, then said, "Start with your daughter. Let her be 19. Let her be a kid sometimes. Stop letting her save you." Frank's eyes filled. "I didn't even realize she was," he whispered. "Now you do," Aaliyah said. "That's the point." They walked toward the exit together, in silence. At the sliding doors, cold air rushed in as someone entered, and Aaliyah caught sight of a small figure just outside under the awning. A girl, maybe 13, thin hoodie, no umbrella, hair damp. She stood with a phone in her hand, staring at the screen the way people do when they're trying to make a dead device come back to life through sheer will. Her shoulders were rigid, and her eyes darted toward the road and back again. Aaliyah stopped so suddenly, Frank almost bumped into her. "What is it?" he asked. Aaliyah didn't answer. She was 12 again, for a heartbeat, tasting rain and humiliation. The girl took a step, hesitated, then looked toward the entrance, as if considering going in and asking for help, but embarrassment kept her rooted. People walked past. A security guard glanced, then looked away. The world kept doing what it always did. Aaliyah's jaw tightened. She walked straight toward the girl, keeping her hands visible and her voice gentle. "Hey," she said, "are you okay? Do you need to call someone?" The girl startled. "I'm fine," she lied instantly, chin lifting. Aaliyah nodded like she believed her, because dignity matters. "Okay." she said. What's your name? A pause. Then, quietly, Maya. Hi, Maya, Aaliyah replied. I'm Aaliyah. Are you trying to get home? Maya's eyes flicked to the road. My mom's inside, she whispered, barely audible. She told me to wait, but my phone's dead and I'm cold, and I don't know if I'm allowed to go back in because they said only one person, and I don't want to get in trouble. Aaliyah's chest ached with recognition. You're not in trouble, she said firmly. Come inside the entrance with me where it's warm. We'll ask at reception together. You don't have to stand out here. Maya hesitated, torn between fear of authority and fear of the cold. Then she nodded and stepped closer. Frank watched, frozen, as if the scene were a mirror held directly up to his face. The girl's damp hoodie, the anxious eyes, the quiet panic trying to look like bravery. Aaliyah guided Maya inside, spoke to reception with calm clarity, and within minutes, a tired woman hurried over, relief washing across her face when she saw her daughter safe. Oh my God, Maya, the woman breathed, pulling her into a hug. I told you not to go far. I didn't, Maya mumbled, voice muffled against her mom's coat. My phone died. The woman looked at Aaliyah, eyes shining. Thank you, she said. Thank you so much. I couldn't leave the ward. And I know, Aaliyah replied softly. It's okay. When they stepped back outside, rain still whispering against the pavement, Frank's face was different. Not just guilty. Awake. I saw it, he said hoarsely. I saw you do it. The exact thing I didn't do. Aaliyah held his gaze. That's why it matters, she replied. Frank swallowed hard. Aaliyah, he said, voice unsteady. If I ever see a kid like that again, I swear to you, I will stop. Aaliyah didn't offer him a neat redemption. She didn't pat his arm and say everything was solved. She gave him something more honest. Then stop, she said simply. Not for me, for them. She turned toward her car, keys cold in her palm, and for the first time that night, she felt something like peace. Not because the past was erased, but because the pattern had been interrupted in real time, in front of the person who once created it. The days after that night did not arrive with dramatic music or instant transformation. They arrived the way real life always does, with phone alarms and unpaid bills and aching muscles and small decisions that either reinforce old habits or slowly replace them. For Aaliyah, the strangest part was how ordinary everything looked on the outside while something inside her had shifted. She still drove evening routes. She still studied in the daytime. She still reminded her mom to drink water and take breaks she never wanted to take. Yet now, threaded through her routines, was the knowledge that a man who once dismissed her fear had sat in her back seat and admitted, without dodging, that he had been wrong. She did not know what to do with that. So, she did what she always did. She kept moving forward. At the hospital, Ellie remained under observation for a couple of days. Frank stayed with her in a way that surprised even him, sleeping upright in a chair, eating vending machine sandwiches without complaint, asking nurses questions he would once have been too proud to ask. The staff, who had seen every variety of parent, noticed the shift quickly. He wasn't the loud, demanding type. He wasn't the absent, indifferent type either. He was the type that frightened them most at first. Desperate, guilty, clinging. Then, as hours turned into days, he became something steadier. He learned the names of the night nurses. He stopped apologizing every second time he spoke. He listened. When Ellie was finally discharged with follow-up appointments and firm advice about rest, hydration, and reducing stress, she walked out of the hospital with a cautious smile and a body that still felt shaky. Frank carried her bag like it weighed nothing, though his face suggested he might have carried a boulder if it meant keeping her safe. They did not have a car to get home. Frank's taxi was still off the road, and the temporary replacement he'd been borrowing from a friend was unavailable. Ellie stood under the hospital awning, pulling her coat tighter, and glanced at her dad. Just book a ride, she said, trying to sound casual, but her eyes searched his face. It's fine. Frank's mouth tightened. For a second, Aaliyah's memory of him, tense and stubborn, flickered. Then he exhaled. Yeah, he said quietly. I'll book one. Ellie blinked, surprised. That's it? No rant about money? Frank rubbed a hand over the back of his neck. I'm done ranting, he muttered, though there was no sharpness in it. I've wasted enough energy on that. A few minutes later, the app confirmed a driver was on the way, and they waited in the damp air, listening to rain tap at the plastic awning above their heads. Ellie shifted her weight, wincing slightly. You know, she said after a while, voice low, you scared me, Dad. I know, he replied, just as low. No, Ellie insisted, turning to face him. I don't mean the hospital. I mean the way you spoke to Aaliyah, the way you looked when you realized it was her. Like you'd been carrying something rotten for years, and you'd hidden it so well you forgot it existed until someone opened the cupboard. Frank flinched, then nodded. That's exactly what it felt like. Ellie's eyes were tired but sharp. Why didn't you ever tell me? She asked. Not her story, I mean. Why didn't you ever tell me you'd done something like that and regretted it? Frank swallowed. Because I didn't want you to see me as that man, he admitted. Because I wanted you to think I was better. Ellie looked down at her hands, then back up. I don't need you to be perfect, she said. I need you to be honest. Do you understand that? Frank's throat worked. Yeah, he said. I do now. A car pulled up to the curb, and the driver rolled down their window to confirm the name. Frank gave the details, helped Ellie into the back seat, and climbed in beside her. As the car moved away from the hospital, Ellie leaned her head against the window and closed her eyes. When they got home, the flat felt smaller than usual. It smelled faintly of damp laundry and reheated food, the scent of a life lived at speed. Ellie sat on the sofa with a blanket around her shoulders, while Frank moved around the kitchen with restless purpose, filling a kettle, rummaging for biscuits, then stopping abruptly, as if he didn't know what to do with his own hands. Sit down, Ellie said, opening her eyes. You're making me dizzy. Frank hesitated. I just want to... I know, Ellie interrupted, but you can't fix everything by moving fast. Sometimes you fix things by staying still. Frank sank into the armchair, looking suddenly older. For a few seconds, he stared at the carpet. Then he spoke in a voice that sounded like it had been scraped down to the truth. I think I've been letting you carry me, he said. Ellie's jaw tightened. I don't mind helping, she said quickly, protective even now. That's the problem, Frank replied, shaking his head. You're 19, and you should be worrying about silly things sometimes. Friends, clothes, music. Whatever you kids young adults worry about now? He gave a weak, humorless smile. Instead, you've been working doubles to cover bills I should have handled. I didn't see how much pressure you were under until you collapsed. Ellie's eyes filled, and she looked away like tears were an inconvenience. I didn't want you to lose the flat, she whispered. Frank's chest rose and fell. I won't let you be the adult in this house anymore, he said. And the sentence landed heavily, because promises were easy and change was hard. Ellie turned back. Then prove it, she said softly. Not with words, with actions. And not for Aaliyah either. For you, for me. Frank nodded, the movement small but firm. Okay, he said. I will. Over the next 2 weeks, he began doing the unglamorous work of proof. He called the taxi licensing office to ask what he needed to do to renew his license safely and legally. And when they listed requirements, he didn't grumble. He booked medical checkups. He called a debt advisor and sat through the embarrassment of explaining his situation to a stranger without dressing it up. He asked Ellie, directly, what she needed from him, and when she said, rest without guilt, he stopped hovering and actually let her sleep. He also did something quieter, something that did not earn applause. On a wet Tuesday evening, Frank was walking back from the pharmacy with a bag of prescriptions when he saw a teenager standing outside a closed takeaway, hood up, shoulders rigid, staring at a phone screen with the same stubborn hope Aaliyah had once had. The boy looked up as Frank approached, eyes wary, ready for judgment. Frank felt fear rise first, the old reflex. Then he remembered the hospital entrance. He remembered Maya's damp hoodie. He remembered the way Aaliyah's voice had said, "Not for me, for them." He stopped at a polite distance and spoke calmly. "You all right, mate?" he asked. "You trying to call someone?" The boy's chin lifted. "I'm fine," he lied immediately. Frank nodded, like he understood the lie. "Okay," he said. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated, then muttered, "Kieran." "All right, Kieran," Frank replied. "My name's Frank. Not asking you to tell me your whole life story. Just checking you're safe. Your phone dead?" Kieran's eyes darted. "Yeah," he admitted, voice flat. "I'm waiting on my cousin. He's meant to pick me up." Frank considered. "You got somewhere warm to wait?" he asked. "Because it's freezing, and people say they're coming and then they don't." Kieran looked away, caught. "I'm not going in anywhere," he muttered. "They'll think I'm robbing them." Frank swallowed the sharp pang of recognition. "I've got a spare charger in my flat," he said. "It's 2 minutes away. You can come charge your phone in the hallway if you want. Door open, I'm not trying to trap you. Or I can just lend you my phone to make the call right here. Your choice." Kieran stared at him like adults didn't offer choices very often. "Why?" he asked suspiciously. "What do you want?" Frank's throat tightened. He answered simply. "Nothing," he said. "I just don't like seeing young people stuck outside at night. Been there." It wasn't a perfect interaction. Frank fumbled some words. He sounded awkward. He had to fight the instinct to lecture. But he stayed. He lent his phone. Kieran called his cousin, got confirmation, and when the cousin arrived 10 minutes later, Kieran nodded at Frank once, a tiny gesture of thanks that looked more like respect than gratitude. Frank walked home with the strange heaviness of doing a good thing without anyone witnessing it, and the even stranger lightness of realizing that this, not dramatic apologies, was what change looked like. Aaliyah did not know about Kieran. She wasn't meant to. She didn't need proof delivered to her like a trophy. Still, life has a way of letting stories overlap. One evening, as Aaliyah was leaving college, with her bag slung over her shoulder, she spotted a familiar figure across the street. Frank stood outside a small community notice board near a library entrance, reading a poster about free budgeting sessions and employment support. He looked up and saw her at the same moment. They froze, both surprised, both unsure. Aaliyah crossed carefully, not rushing. "You okay?" she asked, the question uncomplicated but loaded. Frank nodded. "Yeah," he said. "Ellie's doing better. Follow-ups are booked. I'm trying to get my life back in order." Aaliyah studied his face. He looked tired, but less defensive. "Good," she said, and meant it. He hesitated, then added, "I'm not asking anything from you. Just want you to know I heard you. About stopping. About being the someone." Aaliyah's chest tightened. "That's not a one-time decision," she said quietly. "It's a habit." "I know," Frank replied. "I'm practicing." They stood in a small silence, cars hissing past on wet roads. Then Frank cleared his throat. "There's something else," he said. "Ellie asked me to find you. She wants to talk. Not because she's bored or wants drama. She wants to meet you properly. She said she needs to understand what she's carrying, so she doesn't repeat it." Aaliyah's first instinct was to step back. She had built a stable life by keeping messy, emotional knots at a distance. Then she remembered Ellie's pale face in the hospital bed and the way she'd apologized, without defensiveness. "When?" Aaliyah asked. "Whenever you're comfortable," Frank said quickly. "A cafe. Public. Short. You can bring someone. You can leave anytime. Aaliyah nodded slowly. Okay, she said. One coffee. That's it. Frank's shoulders dropped in relief. Thank you, he said, then stopped himself as if gratitude felt too close to entitlement. And I'm sorry again. I know that doesn't fix anything. Aaliyah held his gaze. It doesn't fix it, she agreed, but it's a start. Keep it a start. As she walked away, her phone buzzed with a new ride request, and she felt the familiar pull of the road calling her back to routine. Yet she also felt something else, a quiet awareness that the story was no longer only about a past wrong. It was about what happened next, when the chance to build something better appeared, not in grand speeches, but in ordinary meetings and small, repeatable choices. Because sometimes the truest redemption isn't the moment someone says sorry, it's the moment they stop making their regret the center of the room and start making their decency a habit. Aaliyah chose the cafe carefully. She picked a place near the college campus where the tables were close enough together that no one would raise their voice, where daylight came in through wide windows, and where there were always other people around, so no one could twist the meeting into something private or intense. Safety was not only about locks and cameras, she had learned. It was also about choosing environments that prevented the worst versions of people from coming out. She arrived 10 minutes early and sat with her back to the wall, a habit she'd never fully shaken. She ordered tea, not coffee, and wrapped both hands around the warm cup while she waited. Her phone was fully charged. Her portable battery sat in her bag anyway. Old instincts did not vanish just because your life improved. When the door opened and Frank walked in with Ellie, Aaliyah felt a strange tightening in her chest. She had expected Ellie to look frail, to move like someone still recovering, but Ellie walked with a careful steadiness, as if she was determined not to let her body embarrass her. She wore a simple hoodie and jeans, hair pulled back, face still pale around the edges, but eyes sharp. Frank hovered half a step behind her, a man trying to learn how to be present without being controlling. Ellie spotted Aaliyah first and offered a small smile that looked like effort. "Hi," she said, as if greeting someone she already knew, rather than someone she'd met under fluorescent lights in fear. "Hi," Aaliyah replied. "How are you feeling today?" Ellie shrugged. "Tired," she admitted. "But better. They're still running tests, but the doctor said it looks like I've been pushing too hard for too long, which is annoying because that sounds so simple." Aaliyah nodded slowly. "Simple doesn't mean easy," she said. Frank cleared his throat, the sound of a man trying to speak without taking over. "I'll get your drink," he murmured to Ellie, then turned to Aaliyah. "Do you want anything?" "I'm fine," Aaliyah said. And she meant it in the literal sense, not the old automatic lie. Frank walked to the counter, leaving the two women at the table in a silence that felt less awkward than Aaliyah expected. Ellie took a breath and looked directly at her. "I asked to meet you," Ellie said, voice steady, "because I don't want to inherit my dad's worst moment and pretend it's just a story about someone else. When he told me what he did, I was angry. Not because I think he's evil, because I can see how easily a person can become that version of themselves and then call it normal." Aaliyah watched her carefully. "You don't need to carry his guilt," she said. "I know," Ellie replied, and her eyes flashed with stubbornness that reminded Aaliyah uncomfortably of her own. "But I do need to carry the lesson. I work in a cafe. I see kids come in dripping wet because they've been told to wait outside while adults talk. I see older men on the street who look like they've stopped expecting anyone to treat them like people. I see women who order one tea and sit there for 3 hours because the warmth is all they've got. I don't want to become someone who looks away." Aaliyah's throat tightened. She hadn't expected this much honesty from someone who could have chosen defensiveness. "Then don't," she said softly. "That's the whole thing. You choose, over and over." Ellie nodded. "I also wanted to say something else," she continued. "I'm sorry. Not in that fake way where someone says sorry, but they mean, please stop being upset so I feel better. I mean, I'm sorry you were alone that night. I'm sorry adults didn't treat your fear like it mattered. And I'm sorry my dad was one of the adults who failed you. Aaliyah held the cup tighter because her hands had started to shake. The apology didn't rewrite the past, but it did something else. It acknowledged the harm without negotiating it down. That mattered more than Ellie probably understood. Thank you, Aaliyah said. I accept that. Ellie exhaled like she'd been holding something in her ribs. Okay, she whispered. That helps. Frank returned with drinks, placing a hot chocolate in front of Ellie and a black coffee in front of himself. He didn't sit immediately. He hovered, as if unsure whether he deserved a chair. Ellie glanced up at him. Sit down, she ordered gently. Frank obeyed, lowering himself into the seat with the careful awkwardness of a man who had spent years being stubborn and was now learning humility. Felt like muscle soreness. For a few minutes, they talked about neutral things. Ellie's follow-up appointment schedule, Aaliyah's college modules, the ridiculous price of groceries, the weather that never decided whether it was winter or spring. It was ordinary conversation, but ordinary conversation was sometimes the bridge that kept people from falling into heavy emotion too quickly. Then Ellie said, casually, the nurse who discharged me was really kind. She reminded me of someone's mom. She had this calm voice like she'd seen everything and still cared. Aaliyah's stomach gave a small lurch of recognition before she knew why. Do you remember her name? She asked, trying to sound casual. Ellie thought. Nadine, she said. Nadine something. She told me off, but in a nice way. She said, your body isn't a machine, love. Aaliyah's breath caught. She stared at Ellie for a beat too long. That's my mom, she said quietly. Frank froze, coffee halfway to his mouth. What? Ellie blinked. Wait, seriously? Aaliyah nodded, the coincidence landing like something heavier than coincidence. My mom is Nadine Mensah, she said. She's a nurse. She worked A&E for years. She still picks up shifts at the Q.E. when they're short. Ellie's eyes widened. She helped me, she whispered, as if the universe had taken their story and tightened the threads. She was there. Frank set his cup down slowly, hands trembling. The color drained from his face in a way that had nothing to do with the cafe lighting. Your mom, he said, voice rough. Your mom is the one who would have come looking for you that night. Aaliyah didn't answer immediately, because the truth of that didn't need decoration. Yes, she said finally. She drove through the rain when she got the call. She was furious. Not at me, at the world. Frank stared down at the table, shame rolling through him like a tide. I've avoided thinking about that part, he admitted. I've always pictured you alone, because it made it easier to pretend my decision didn't ripple out. But of course there was a mother. Of course there was a woman working her shift and praying her kid wasn't hurt. Ellie's face tightened with emotion. Dad, she said, low. You need to apologize to her. Frank flinched. I know. Aaliyah's jaw tightened. He doesn't need to show up at her door and make her relive it, she said, protective instinct rising fast. My mom doesn't need a stranger's guilt on top of her own memories. Frank lifted his eyes, and for the first time Aaliyah saw something like quiet resolve behind the remorse. You're right, he said. She doesn't. But I do need to say it, not to make myself feel clean, because I've been letting her carry a piece of that night without even knowing the man who caused it ever faced it. Ellie leaned forward, voice firm despite her fatigue. And because you need to learn to be accountable without expecting comfort, she added. Frank nodded, swallowing. Yes. Aaliyah's mind ran through possibilities the way it always did. Risk, boundaries, safety, control. She could refuse outright and protect her mother from an old wound being reopened. She could allow it and risk stirring anger that might take days to settle. She could mediate and make sure it stayed respectful. What exactly do you want to say? Aaliyah asked. voice cautious. Frank breathed out slowly. I want to tell her I'm sorry I failed her child, he said. I want to tell her I was wrong, that I was selfish, that it could have ended badly, and it didn't only because someone else stepped in. And I want to tell her that because of her daughter, I'm changing. Not as a story, as a habit. Ellie's eyes filled, but she blinked it away. He's been trying, she said to Aaliyah, not defending him, just stating a fact. He called dead advice. He's been cooking. He's been letting me rest. He helped a teenager charge his phone the other night. I saw him do the budgeting worksheet without swearing. Aaliyah almost smiled at that, then stopped herself. This wasn't a comedy scene. Still, it mattered that Ellie wasn't selling a fantasy. She was describing small actions, the kind that actually made people different over time. Aaliyah sat very still for a moment, hearing her mother's voice in her mind. The way Nadine always said that forgiveness was not an obligation. It was a choice you made for your own peace when it was safe. Aaliyah knew her mom. Nadine would be furious. Nadine would also respect a sincere apology if it came without demands. I'll talk to her, Aaliyah said finally. I'm not promising she'll want to meet you, but I'll tell her what happened, what you said, and that you want to apologize properly. Frank's shoulders sagged in relief, and he caught himself, as if remembering relief wasn't the point. Thank you, he said anyway, voice thick. Whatever she decides, I'll accept it. Ellie exhaled, then looked at Aaliyah with something like admiration. You don't have to do any of this, she said softly. You could have driven away and never thought about us again. Aaliyah stared at her tea. I could have, she admitted, but I'm tired of stories ending with people walking away. I'm tired of someone else will help. Frank nodded slowly, as if those words were being stamped into him. They finished their drinks, and the meeting ended without hugs or dramatic speeches. It ended with something quieter. Ellie paying for her hot chocolate, even though Frank tried to. Aaliyah insisting on walking them to the door because she didn't want Ellie wobbling outside alone. Frank holding the cafe door open for a stranger with a pram and then looking slightly startled, as if he'd forgotten that decency could be automatic if you practiced it enough. Outside, the rain had eased into a fine mist. Ellie pulled her hood up, then paused. Aaliyah, she said, turning back. If your mom says yes to seeing my dad, can I come too? Not as backup, as a witness. I want to see him apologize the right way. Aaliyah considered it, then nodded once. If my mom agrees, she said, we do it on her terms. Frank's eyes shone, and he looked away quickly, embarrassed by how close to tears he was in public. Her terms, he repeated, like an oath. As Aaliyah watched them walk away, she felt the strange weight of what she had agreed to. She had opened a door that might lead to healing or to anger, and she would need to protect her mother's peace either way. Yet she also felt something else beneath the caution, the possibility that accountability, when done properly, could relieve a burden that had been sitting in her family story for a decade. And in a small flat across town, Nadine Mensah would soon receive a call from her daughter that began with a sentence no mother expected to hear. Mom, Aaliyah would say, do you remember the night I got stuck in the rain when I was 12? Aaliyah waited until the end of her mom's shift to call. She knew Nadine's patterns well enough to predict when she would be least able to cope and most likely to listen. Too early, and Nadine would still be running on adrenaline and caffeine, snapping at anything that sounded like extra work. Too late, and she would be so drained that even a gentle conversation could feel like a weight on her chest. So Aaliyah called at the in-between hour, when the hospital car park was thinning, when the sky was the color of wet slate, and when Nadine would be sitting in her car for 5 minutes before driving home, staring forward as if convincing her body it still had another task in it. Nadine answered on the third ring. Hi, love, she said, voice tired, but warm. You okay? Aaliyah swallowed. Yeah, she replied. I'm okay. Are you driving? Not yet, Nadine said. I'm in the car. Why? You sound careful. Aaliyah stared at the pavement outside her flat, watching a neighbor drag bins to the curb. Her fingers tightened around her phone. Mom, she began, do you remember the night I got stuck in the rain when I was 12? Silence, immediate and heavy. Nadine didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She didn't need to. Aaliyah heard the shift in her breathing, the way a memory can sit up in a person like a sleeping dog, suddenly alert. Of course I remember, Nadine said finally, voice flatter now. Why are we talking about that? Aaliyah took a slow breath. Because I met the taxi driver, she said. The one who refused to take me. He ended up in my car. I drive now, Mum. Private hire. I picked him up as a passenger. For a heartbeat, Nadine said nothing at all. Then her voice sharpened. What do you mean you picked him up? Aaliyah, why would you? I didn't know at first, Aaliyah interrupted quickly. Not until he said his name. Frank Hargreaves. And Mom, listen, I know this is a lot, but it happened because he needed to get to the queue. E. His daughter collapsed at work and was an A and E. Nadine's breath caught. Was she hurt? Stable, Aaliyah said. She's okay. She was exhausted. They're running tests, but she's okay. Nadine exhaled slowly, like anger didn't know where to land when the situation included a sick child. All right, she said through her teeth. Go on. Aaliyah told her everything, carefully, without drama. She described the ride, the moment Frank recognized her, the apology he offered, the way Ellie looked when she asked why her father would do something like that to a child. She described the girl outside the hospital, Maya, and how the whole night had felt like the past echoing until someone answered differently. When Aaliyah finished, Nadine spoke so softly, Aaliyah had to hold the phone closer. So, he wants to apologize, Nadine said. Yes, Aaliyah replied. He asked. Ellie asked too, actually, but I told him it would be your choice, your terms. Nadine gave a short laugh with no humor in it. My terms, she repeated, as if testing the phrase. Aaliyah, that night, I drove through the rain feeling like my heart was outside my body. Do you understand that? I pictured every headline. I pictured you in a ditch. I pictured a man's hand on your arm. I pictured you calling for me and no sound coming out. Her voice thickened. And then I got you home and I smiled and I made soup and I told you you did well and inside I wanted to tear the world in half. Aaliyah's eyes stung. I know, she whispered. No, Nadine said, gentle now. You don't. You can't. Not fully. Because you were the child. The fear belonged to you, and it also belonged to me. I carried mine quietly, so you could sleep. Aaliyah pressed her knuckles to her lips, fighting tears. I'm sorry, she breathed. Nadine's tone softened instantly. Don't, she said. This isn't your fault. None of it. But hear me clearly, Aaliyah. That man doesn't get to step into my life now, 10 years later, and unload his guilt like it's my job to carry it. I know, Aaliyah said. That's why I wasn't sure I should even tell you. Nadine went quiet again. Aaliyah imagined her mother's face in the car, eyes forward, jaw tight, hands on the steering wheel even though the engine was off. Then Nadine said something Aaliyah didn't expect. Does he look? Sorry. Aaliyah blinked. Yes, she said. He does. And does he look like he wants forgiveness? Nadine asked, voice cautious. Or does he look like he finally understands what he did? Aaliyah thought back to Frank's expression when he watched Maya standing outside the hospital, damp and scared and trying to look tough. He understands, Aaliyah said. At least, I think he does. Nadine sighed. All right, she said, and there was a reluctant steadiness in her voice. I will give him 10 minutes, not because he deserves it, because I deserve to say what I've carried for years. And because I don't want that night to be the only way I remember your childhood. Aaliyah's chest tightened with relief and fear. Okay, she said. Where do you want to meet? Not our home, Nadine said immediately. I'm not having that energy in my living room. Fair, Aaliyah replied. Hospital cafeteria? Nadine decided. Daytime, busy, one table, 10 minutes. Aaliyah nodded even though her mom couldn't see it. I'll set it up, she said. And Mom, you can end it whenever you want. You don't have to be polite. I know, Nadine replied. I taught you that, remember. 2 days later, the hospital cafeteria smelled of chips, coffee, and disinfectant that never quite left the building. The lunchtime crowd created a steady wall of noise, which suited Nadine perfectly. There would be no theatrical whispers here, no space for anyone to raise their voice. Public decency would keep everyone's worst impulses on a leash. Aaliyah arrived first with Nadine. Her mother wore her uniform, hair pulled back, eyes tired but fierce. She sat down facing the entrance, as if she wanted full control over what she saw coming. Aaliyah sat slightly to the side, not between them, but close enough to intervene if needed. Ellie arrived with Frank a few minutes later. Ellie looked better than she had in A&E, color returning to her cheeks, though she still moved carefully. Frank looked like a man going to court, shoulders tense, hands clasped too tightly. He spotted Nadine and froze. Nadine didn't stand. She didn't smile. She simply watched him approach with the calm of someone who had handled far scarier situations than an apologetic man. Frank stopped at the table, not sitting until Nadine spoke. You're Frank, Nadine said. Yes, he replied, voice strained. Yes, ma'am. Nadine's eyebrows lifted slightly at the ma'am, unimpressed by respect that arrived late. Sit, she said. Frank sat. Ellie remained standing for a second, then sat too, hands folded, eyes moving between faces, as if bracing for impact. Nadine didn't waste time. 10 years ago, she began, voice level. My daughter was 12. She was stuck in the rain. She asked you for a ride home. You left her. Frank's throat worked. Yes, he said, I did. Nadine leaned forward a fraction. Do you know what that did to her? She asked. Frank's eyes shone. I know it hurt her, he said. I know it scared her. I know it taught her a lesson she never should have learned. Nadine nodded once, sharp. And do you know what it did to me? Frank's voice dropped. It made you think you'd lost her, he whispered. It made you drive through the city in a storm with your heart in your throat. Nadine stared at him. Yes, she said simply. That's it. A silence fell. The cafeteria noise continued around them, people laughing, trays clattering, life moving on without caring about the small private earthquake at one table. Frank swallowed hard and spoke. Nadine, he said, using her name carefully, I am sorry. I'm sorry I failed your child. I'm sorry I made your world bigger and more frightening when it was already hard enough. I was selfish and I was wrong, and nothing about my day justified what I did. You don't owe me forgiveness. I'm saying it because you deserve to hear that I see it clearly now. Nadine held his gaze for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, controlled, and lethal in its honesty. Do you know what I hate most? She said. Frank shook his head, barely moving. I hate that my daughter grew up and became the kind of person who stops for others, Nadine said. And part of the reason she became that is because she learned at 12 that she couldn't rely on adults. Do you understand how twisted that is? That my child turned pain into goodness because she had to, not because she should. Aaliyah's throat tightened. Ellie's eyes filled. Frank's shoulders sagged. Yes, he whispered. I understand. Nadine exhaled slowly. Good, she said. Because I'm not here to comfort you. I'm here to tell you that what you did didn't end when you drove away. It became part of our family story. It became part of her habits. It became part of the way she plans her life. Frank nodded, tears slipping down his cheek. Now, he didn't wipe them away. He didn't turn it into a performance. He simply sat with them, as if finally accepting he had no right to escape the discomfort. Ellie leaned forward, voice trembling. "Mrs. Mensah," she said softly, "I'm Ellie. I just want you to know, she helped me. Your daughter helped my dad get to me. And your care helped me too. You discharged me. You told me off, in a kind way." Nadine's expression softened a fraction at Ellie, because kindness was Nadine's reflex even when anger burned. "I remember you," Nadine said, "and I'm glad you're okay." Ellie nodded, swallowing. "My dad's been trying," she added, "not begging, just stating. I'm not asking you to forgive him fast. I want him to be better than he was, and I want to be better too." Nadine studied Ellie's face, then looked back at Frank. "Here's what I'll say," she said. "I don't forgive you today. Maybe I never will. That's not a punishment. It's just the truth. But I accept your apology as words. Now you need to turn them into a life." Frank nodded rapidly. "I will," he whispered. Nadine lifted a hand slightly, stopping him from adding more promises. "No grand vows," she said. "I've seen too many people swear they'll change and then do nothing. You want to make a difference. Start by doing it where it counts." Frank swallowed. "Tell me," he said. Nadine's eyes narrowed, practical. "There's a youth charity near here," she said. "They run a safe weight scheme for kids who get stranded, battery chargers, warm drinks, phone access, a staff member who calls a parent or guardian. They're always short on volunteers and donations." Aaliyah blinked. She hadn't known her mom even knew about that program. Nadine continued, "You're not going to swoop in like a hero. You're not going to post it online. You're not going to make it about your guilt. You're going to give time or money quietly, consistently, for a year. Then we can talk about whether your apology meant anything." Frank nodded, face wet. "Yes," he said, "I can do that." Nadine looked at Aaliyah then, and her gaze softened fully. "And you," she said gently, "you don't have to keep being the strong one all the time. You can let people help you too." Aaliyah's eyes filled. "I know," she whispered. "I'm learning." Nadine stood, checking her watch. 10 minutes, she said. "Time's up." She looked at Frank one last time. "You got the words out. Now live the rest." Frank rose too, careful, respectful. "Thank you for giving me the chance to say it," he said. Nadine didn't respond with warmth, but she did respond with something that mattered more. She nodded once, a small acknowledgement that he had faced her without excuses. As Nadine and Aaliyah walked away through the cafeteria crowd, Aaliyah realized her shoulders felt lighter, not because the past had been erased, but because it had finally been named out loud by the person who had carried the heaviest part of it. Behind them, Ellie placed a hand on her father's arm. Frank stood very still, eyes closed for a moment, as if absorbing the fact that accountability didn't come with comfort. It came with responsibility. And for the first time in 10 years, the story of that rainy night began to loosen its grip, not because the taxi driver was forgiven, but because the mother, who never forgot, had finally been heard. Frank did not transform overnight, and the most important part of that was that he stopped trying to. After the cafeteria meeting, he went home and sat at his kitchen table for a long time without turning the television on, because the quiet left him nowhere to hide. He kept hearing Nadine's voice, steady and unsparing, telling him not to make grand vows, telling him to live the rest. He realized he had spent years thinking regret was the same thing as change, because regret felt painful, and pain felt like payment. But pain did not rebuild what you had damaged. Only behavior did. So he started small, exactly as he'd been told. On Monday morning, he called the youth charity Nadine had mentioned and asked how volunteering worked. He expected suspicion, a lecture, maybe a polite brush-off, because that was what he thought he deserved. Instead, a calm coordinator named Janine asked simple questions about availability and skills, the way someone speaks to a person who is either going to show up or not. Because in charity work, you learn quickly that speeches don't carry chairs, and guilt doesn't refill a kettle. We run a safe weight scheme, Janine explained. Young people get stranded, batteries die, buses don't come, parents get stuck at work, and sometimes kids are too scared to go to the police or walk into a random shop. We keep the lights on for a couple of hours in the evening, hot drinks, phone charging, staff support, and we ring guardians or arrange a safe pickup. Frank's stomach tightened as he pictured it, because it was the version of the world that should have existed for Aaliyah 10 years ago, and because it did exist now, meaning his choice back then was even uglier in contrast. "What do you need?" he asked, voice hoarse. "We need consistency," Janine said simply. "We need volunteers who show up when it's wet and boring and nothing dramatic happens. We need people who can keep calm, follow safeguarding rules, and treat young people with respect. Can you do that?" Frank swallowed. "Yes," he said. "I can." Janine told him the training date, the paperwork, the boundaries, and the non-negotiable rules. Frank didn't argue. He didn't try to bargain himself into feeling better. He filled in the forms, attended the safeguarding session, and sat through the uncomfortable parts where he had to admit, in a room with other adults, that the world was full of children who had learned not to trust grown-ups. On his first evening shift, he arrived early with a carrier bag full of cheap biscuits and a multi-pack of phone charging cables he had bought on sale. He didn't hand them over like gifts. He asked where they should go. He followed instructions. He learned the system. At 7 o'clock, the first young person arrived, a skinny boy with a backpack and a hard stare that dared anyone to treat him like a nuisance. The boy didn't say hello, didn't say thank you, didn't even sit down properly. He hovered near the wall, eyes scanning the room like he was memorizing escape routes. Frank felt the old reflex stir, the part of him that used to decide who was safe and who was trouble based on nothing but posture and fear. He caught it in his chest and held it there until it couldn't move his mouth. Janine introduced the boy to the room with easy familiarity. "This is Reese," she said. "Reese, this is Frank. Frank's helping out tonight." Reese looked at Frank like he was trying to see through him. "Whatever," he muttered. Frank nodded once. "All right," he said, keeping his voice calm. "You want a charger, or a drink, or just to sit. Your call." Reese blinked, confused, by being offered a choice without strings. He didn't soften immediately, but he moved toward the charging station. Frank didn't hover. He didn't lecture. He simply stayed present, available, ordinary. Over the next few weeks, Frank showed up again and again, doing the unglamorous jobs. He wiped tables. He refilled sugar. He listened to stories without asking for the dramatic version. He learned which kids hated being called mate and which kids hated being called love. He learned that some teenagers acted rude because politeness felt like surrender. He learned that safety sometimes looked like a room where nobody asked too many questions too quickly. He didn't tell Aaliyah about any of it. That was the point. Meanwhile, Ellie recovered in the slow, frustrating way that didn't suit her personality. The doctors told her to reduce stress, and she rolled her eyes because she had always been the kind of person who solved problems by carrying them. Frank changed the flat's rhythm to help her without making her feel like a patient. He cooked simple meals. He sat down to eat with her instead of grabbing food on the go. He stopped treating money worries like a secret war he had to fight alone and started involving professionals who actually knew what they were doing. Ellie, with her restless mind and her stubborn heart, needed somewhere to put her energy that wasn't work. One afternoon, she messaged Aaliyah, "Can I ask you something without it being weird?" Aaliyah replied a few minutes later, "Try." Ellie asked if she could ride along for a couple of hours on one of Aaliyah's shifts. Once she was cleared to do normal activities again, not to play hero, but to understand what it meant to be the person behind the wheel in a city full of people needing to get somewhere safely. Aaliyah said yes, but on strict terms, and those terms sounded a lot like the boundaries Aaliyah had built her whole life on. 2 hours, she wrote. Daytime. Public areas. You don't talk to passengers unless they talk to you first. And you don't take over my job because you feel sorry for someone. Ellie wrote back. Deal. On the day they did it, Ellie sat in the front passenger seat with a bottle of water and a notebook, like she was trying to be a student of the world rather than its judge. She watched Aaliyah's calm routines, the way she checked mirrors and confirmed names, and kept her tone friendly without being careless. After one ride, Ellie said quietly, "You're always scanning." Aaliyah didn't deny it. "That's part of the job," she said. Then, after a beat, she added, "And part of being 12 in the rain." Ellie's face tightened. "I hate that," she said. "I don't," Aaliyah replied, surprising them both. "It's not fair, but it made me skilled. It made me careful. It made me someone people can trust. I just wish I'd learned it without the fear." Ellie nodded slowly. "I'm going to learn it without the fear," she said, more like a promise than a statement. "I'm going to learn it because you're showing me." Aaliyah didn't respond with warmth that would make it sentimental. She responded with truth. "Then show up for other people," she said. "That's how it matters." That was how the 3 lives began to shift into a strange shape that looked almost like community. Not friends in the easy way, not family in the traditional way, but something real and difficult and useful. And then, on a Friday night in late autumn, the rain returned with the same stubbornness it always had, as if the city was trying to see who people became when the weather matched their memories. Frank finished his volunteer shift and walked home with his hood up, hands buried in his coat pockets. The streetlights trembled in puddles. He was tired in a normal way now, the way you feel after doing something that matters, instead of the frantic exhaustion of scrambling for survival. Halfway down a side road, near a parade of closed shops, he saw a small figure by a bus stop. A girl, maybe 13, maybe younger. Hoodie too thin, no umbrella. Phone held up in front of her face like it was the only tool she had left. She wasn't crying. That was what made it worse, because she looked like someone who had decided crying didn't help. Frank stopped. No one was watching him. There were no cameras angled for applause. There was no Aaliyah nearby to witness his choice. There was only a wet street and a child trying not to be scared. For a second, the old Frank appeared in his mind like a ghost, whispering, "Not your problem. Keep walking. You've done enough." Then he heard Nadine's voice in his head, steady and sharp. "Live the rest." He approached slowly, not looming, not rushing. "You all right?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. "You waiting on someone?" The girl snapped her head up, eyes wary. "I'm fine," she said automatically, like it was a script. Frank nodded, as if he believed her. "Okay," he said. "What's your name?" She hesitated, then muttered, "Keisha." "All right, Keisha," Frank replied. "I'm Frank. Your phone, dead." Keisha's jaw tightened, then she gave a tiny nod. Frank felt the memory of Aaliyah at 12 press into his chest like a hand. He didn't let it become a speech. He made it practical. "There's a warm place 2 minutes from here," he said, gesturing toward the community center where the Safe Wait scheme ran. "Lights on, staff inside, phone chargers, and they can ring whoever you need. You don't have to stand out here." Keisha stared at him, suspicion fighting relief. "Are you trying to trick me?" she asked, voice small but sharp. Frank swallowed. "No," he said simply. "I'm trying to make sure you get home." She studied his face, as if searching for the lie. Then she looked at the rain, at the empty road, at her useless phone. "Okay," she whispered. Frank walked beside her, not grabbing her arm, not rushing, just matching her pace. At the center, Janine opened the door and looked at Frank in surprise. "You're off shift," she said. Frank nodded. "Found someone outside," he replied. "Phone dead." Janine's expression softened instantly, and she stepped aside. "Come in, love," she said to Keisha. "We'll sort it." Frank didn't stay to be thanked. He didn't hover to feel good about himself. He gave Janine the relevant details, stepped back, and let the system do what it was built to do. As he walked home alone, rain still soaking his sleeves, he realized something that hurt and healed at the same time. He had just done the thing he didn't do 10 years ago. Not because someone forced him, not because someone watched him, not because he wanted forgiveness, because he had finally practiced decency enough times that it was starting to feel like his natural response instead of an occasional performance. And somewhere across town, Aaliyah was driving her own shift, not knowing what Frank had just done. And that was exactly how it should be, because the night wasn't about her witnessing his change. It was about a girl named Keisha getting out of the rain. Aaliyah heard about Keisha 2 days later, not through Frank, and not through some dramatic confession, but through the quiet channels that real community work runs on. Her mom rang her on a Sunday afternoon while Aaliyah was in her kitchen, chopping onions and listening to the kettle build toward a boil. "You remember that safe weight scheme I told you about?" Nadine asked, voice brisk, with the tiredness of someone who had already done a full week by mid-Sunday. "Yeah," Aaliyah replied, wiping her hands on a towel. "Why?" Nadine paused, and Aaliyah felt her stomach tighten, because pauses from her mother often meant something mattered. Janine said a volunteer walked a girl in off the street on Friday night. Nadine said, "Phone dead, rain, bus stop." The girl's mom couldn't leave work, but the scheme sorted it, got her picked up safe. Aaliyah's throat went dry. "Okay," she said carefully. "That's good." Nadine exhaled. "It is good," she agreed. The volunteer was Frank. Aaliyah sat down slowly, as if the chair had risen to meet her. For a moment, she didn't speak, because the image landed too precisely on top of her own memories. Wet pavement. A child pretending not to be scared. A decision made in the dark. "He told you," Aaliyah said, and she couldn't keep the edge out of her voice. "No," Nadine replied, calm. "He didn't come running to me for praise. Janine mentioned it in passing when I asked how the week had been. It wasn't a story in his mouth. It was just something he did." Aaliyah closed her eyes briefly. Something in her chest loosened, not into forgiveness, but into relief that the world had been answered differently for one girl. "What was her name?" Aaliyah asked. "Keisha," Nadine said. Janine said she was quiet at first, suspicious. Then she drank the hot chocolate like she'd been holding herself together with nothing but stubbornness. Aaliyah swallowed. "I know that look," she murmured. "So do I," Nadine replied, softer now. "And that's why I'm calling, because I'm not ready to be warm toward Frank. But I can admit when a person is doing the right thing for once, even if it's late." Aaliyah stared at the chopped onions, vision blurring slightly. "Does it make you feel better?" she asked. "Or does it make you angrier that it took him this long?" There was a long pause. "Both," Nadine answered honestly. "But I'm choosing to focus on the child who got out of the rain. That's the point, isn't it?" After she hung up, Aaliyah stood at her sink for a while, without moving. She realized she had been bracing for Frank to disappoint her again, not because she wanted to punish him, but because preparing for disappointment had kept her safe for most of her life. If you never expected decency, you couldn't be crushed when it didn't arrive. Now she had to sit with a new, unsettling reality. Frank had done the right thing when nobody was watching. That same week, Frank faced his own uncomfortable truth in a different setting. He sat in a small office with a debt advisor named Malcolm, who wore a tie that looked too cheerful for the job. Malcolm went through Frank's numbers with calm precision, circling totals and writing options on a pad. "You can stabilize this," Malcolm said, tapping the page. "But you need consistent income, and you need to stop pretending you can muscle your way through with willpower." Frank nodded, jaw tight. "I'm trying to get my taxi license back," he said. Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Is that the best plan for your health?" he asked. "And for your stress. Because your daughter just landed in hospital from stress. You two can't keep running your lives like you're both trying to outrun something." Frank flinched, because it was true. Driving had been his identity, his pride, his excuse, his shield. It was also part of why he'd become the man who shut a window on a child. Long hours, constant pressure, fear of being cheated, fear of not coping. It had sharpened him in all the wrong directions. "I don't know what else I am," Frank admitted. Malcolm looked up from the paper. "That's not a financial problem," he said gently. "That's a life problem. But you're allowed to start over, Frank. People do it all the time. They just don't brag about it." That evening, Frank went to his volunteer shift and found himself watching the room differently. He watched Reese, who now nodded at him occasionally instead of pretending Frank didn't exist. He watched a shy girl who only spoke when Janine offered her a pen and asked her to write down her mom's number, as if writing felt safer than saying it aloud. He watched the relief on parents' faces when they arrived, embarrassed and grateful, and trying to hide both. Frank realized something with a clarity that made his chest ache. He didn't miss driving the way he thought he would. He missed being useful. After the shift, Janine locked up and glanced at him. "You okay?" she asked, noticing the way he lingered. Frank hesitated, then spoke carefully. "I've been thinking," he said. "If you ever need someone in the daytime too, for admin, phone calls, whatever, I can help. I'm trying to rebuild my life. I want to put my time somewhere that matters." Janine studied him, not suspicious, but serious. "We always need people," she said. "But you need to understand, this isn't redemption theater. It's work." Frank nodded. "Good," he said quietly. "I'm tired of theater." Meanwhile, Ellie made a choice that surprised her father and, in a quieter way, surprised herself. She messaged Aaliyah again, short and direct. "I want to volunteer there." Aaliyah stared at the message for a long moment before replying. "At the Safe Weight scheme," she typed. "Why?" Ellie's answer came quickly. "Because I saw Maya outside the hospital, and I can't unsee her," she wrote. "Because I was the girl in the bed, and I realized how easily kids get left in hallways and car parks while adults do adult things. Because I don't want to be the kind of person who learns empathy only when it happens to me." Aaliyah's fingers hovered over the screen. Her instinct was to protect the boundaries she'd built, to keep these worlds separate. But another part of her remembered what it had meant when Mr. Singh had stepped out from behind his counter and made her fear his problem for a while. So she wrote back. "If you do it properly," she typed. "Training, rules, consistency, no savior mood." Ellie replied, "Deal." When Frank found out Ellie had applied, he reacted with panic dressed up as concern. "You don't need to do that," he said, standing in their kitchen with a tea towel in his hand like it was armor. "You need to rest. You need to focus on school or work or whatever you're doing next." Ellie looked at him with the calm, relentless firmness she'd developed from years of being the one who carried the weight. "Dad," she said, "I'm not doing this to punish myself. I'm doing it because I want to build something in me that doesn't collapse when life gets hard." Frank's throat tightened. "You shouldn't have to be the one teaching yourself that," he whispered. Ellie softened. "I'm not teaching myself," she replied. "I'm learning from other people who already know. I'm learning from Aaliyah, and I'm learning from you too when you show up." Frank blinked hard, eyes shining. A week later, the three of them were in the same room again, not at a cafe, not in a hospital, not in a place heavy with apology, but in a small community center hall with plastic chairs and a whiteboard. Janine ran the volunteer induction with practiced clarity, covering safeguarding, boundaries, the difference between support and control, the importance of not making young people perform gratitude for basic care. Aaliyah sat at the back, not as a volunteer, but as someone invited to give a short talk about safety from a driver's perspective. She hadn't planned to accept. Then she thought about 12-year-old Aaliyah, and she went. When Janine asked her to share one practical piece of advice, Aaliyah said the simplest thing she could. Assume someone's fear makes sense, she told the room, even when their behavior is messy. Fear doesn't always look polite. Frank listened with his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles went pale. Ellie listened with her jaw set, taking notes like she was collecting tools she'd use for the rest of her life. After the session, as people filtered out, Janine approached Aaliyah. "You know," she said quietly, "we're trying to get funding for more charging stations and emergency travel vouchers for young people who need to get home safely. It's always a battle." Aaliyah nodded. "How much?" she asked, practical as her mother. Janine blinked. "It depends," she said cautiously. "Why?" Aaliyah didn't look at Frank when she answered. She didn't make it about him. She made it about the gap in the world that had once swallowed her fear. "I can help," she said. "I can put something aside from driving, and I can ask my college if they'll support it as a community project. Quietly. No videos, no pity story." Janine's expression softened into something like relief. "That would matter," she said. "A lot." As Aaliyah walked to her car afterwards, she noticed Frank standing by the door, waiting but not blocking her. He looked nervous, like a man trying to speak without making himself the center. "Aaliyah," he said when she approached. She paused. "Yes. I heard about Keisha from Janine," he said, voice low. "I didn't tell you. I wasn't trying to hide it. I knew it wasn't for you." Aaliyah studied him for a beat. "Good," she said. "It wasn't." Frank swallowed. "I'm applying for a part-time job here," he admitted. "Not driving, support work, admin, whatever they'll take me for. I don't know if I'll get it. But I'm trying to build my life around being useful in the right way." Aaliyah nodded slowly, then surprised him by saying, "That's smarter than pretending you can go back to the same life and somehow be a different person inside it." Frank's eyes shone. "I don't deserve you saying that," he whispered. Aaliyah's voice stayed steady. "I'm not saying it to reward you," she replied. "I'm saying it because I'm tired of people wasting their one chance to change." Frank nodded, absorbing it like a lesson he intended to keep. Then he said, carefully, "Your mom, is she okay?" Aaliyah's expression softened at the mention of Nadine. "She's fine," she said. "She's still angry, but she's always been allowed to be." She also noticed what you did for Keisha. Don't expect a hug. But she noticed. Frank exhaled, a sound that was half relief and half humility. "That's enough," he said quietly. "For now." As Aaliyah drove away, she passed a bus stop where two teenagers sat under the shelter, laughing at something on a phone, shoulders touching, warm in their own little world. The sight made her chest ache in a strange, hopeful way. Not every child was alone in the rain. Not every story ended with a slammed window. Some ended with a door held open, a charger offered, a kettle boiling, and a group of flawed people learning, slowly and imperfectly, to become the someone they used to assume would be somebody else. The final test didn't arrive with a warning. It never does. It arrived disguised as an ordinary Friday, the kind that makes you believe your life has finally become predictable, right up until it proves you wrong. Aaliyah had just finished a daytime class and was sitting in her car outside the college car park, answering a message from her mom about what to pick up for dinner. Nadine wanted plantain. Aaliyah wanted something quick, and they were negotiating in the familiar, loving way they always did, half practical and half teasing. Her phone buzzed again. Not a ride request. A call from Janine. Aaliyah frowned and answered, "Hi, is everything okay?" Janine's voice sounded tighter than usual. "We've got a situation," she said. "One of the young people came in shaking," says her friend didn't. "We've tried ringing. We've tried messaging. We've got a last known location near the old underpass by the retail park. It's wet, it's getting dark, and I don't like it." Aaliyah's stomach dropped. "Have you called the police?" "We're doing that," Janine replied quickly. "But you know how it goes. They ask questions first. We need someone on the ground who can get there fast and keep eyes open without spooking her. Frank is here with me. He wants to go." Aaliyah's chest tightened. Frank's name still carried weight in her body, the way certain words do, even after you've forgiven the sound of them. "Is he trained for that?" she asked. Janine didn't pretend. "Not for anything risky," she admitted. "But he knows the limits. He's asking if you can drive him close. We're not chasing anyone. We're looking, we're calling. We're trying to get the girl into lights and warmth." Aaliyah glanced at the gray sky. Rain streaked her windscreen like thin threads. She didn't hesitate long enough for fear to vote. "I'm on my way," she said. She drove fast but not reckless, tires whispering on wet roads, wipers moving steadily. She told herself it was just a welfare check, just an anxious friend, just the kind of thing that resolved with a phone call and a relieved parent. Still, her mind kept flashing back to the simplest fact she knew. Bad things don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they arrive quietly, when a child is cold and embarrassed and trying not to look like they need help. At the community center, the safe weight room glowed warm behind the glass doors. Inside, a handful of teens sat with charging cables and hot drinks, pretending they weren't watching the staff more closely than usual. Frank stood near the entrance, with his coat on already, hands clasped. Ellie was there too, hair tied back, eyes alert in the way Aaliyah recognized from people who had decided to be useful. When Aaliyah stepped in, Frank looked at her like he didn't deserve her arriving, yet relief still broke through his face. "Thank you," he started. "Don't," Aaliyah said gently. "Not unkind, just firm. Tell me what you know." Janine introduced them to a skinny girl with a tight braid and a trembling jaw. Her name was Tasha. She was 15 and trying very hard not to cry because she didn't want to be treated like a kid. "My friend's name is Leanne," Tasha said, voice shaky. She said she was coming here, but she was upset. She's been sleeping at her auntie's, and her auntie's boyfriend is horrible. She messaged me from near the underpass, and then she stopped replying. Aaliyah's chest went cold. Underpasses were the kind of places grown-ups told you to avoid. But young people still ended up there because routes were routes, because shortcuts were tempting, because the world wasn't designed around keeping them safe. Janine looked at Frank. "Remember," she said quietly, "not as a threat, but as a boundary. You don't go alone. You don't go into dark areas. You stay visible. You call it in. Your support, not a hero." Frank nodded once. "I know," he said, voice tight. Ellie swallowed. "I can come too," she offered. Janine shook her head immediately. "No," she said gently but firmly. "You stay here with Tasha. You're doing the right thing by being steady. Don't turn this into a chase." Ellie flinched, but she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. Aaliyah turned to Frank. "Get in," she said. They drove in silence at first. The underpass sat behind a retail park where the lights always felt too far apart, pools of brightness separated by stretches of gray. Aaliyah parked where the street lamp worked and kept her doors locked until they decided what to do next. Frank stared out through the rain. "This is where people end up when they've got nowhere else," he murmured. Aaliyah didn't answer because he wasn't wrong, and the truth didn't need commentary. They got out and stood in the light. Aaliyah rang Janine to confirm they'd arrived. Frank rang the number Tasha had given for Leanne, straight to voicemail. Aaliyah sent a calm text, the kind that didn't accuse, didn't pressure, just offered a clear option. "Hi, Leanne. This is Aaliyah from the Safeway team. We're nearby. If you can see this, reply with a thumbs up or your location. You're not in trouble. We just want you safe." Minutes passed. Rain drummed softly. Cars hissed in the distance. Frank shifted restlessly, eyes scanning the darker edge of the underpass. "I could just—" Aaliyah cut in quietly. "No," she said. "You don't go into the dark. You don't become a story." Frank swallowed and forced himself still. "Right," he whispered. "Right." Then Aaliyah saw it. Not movement exactly. More like a shape that didn't belong. Near the far end of the underpass, just beyond the brightest pool of light, something pale against the concrete wall. A person curled inward, trying to disappear. Aaliyah's heart hammered. She raised her phone and used the torch, not sweeping wildly, just angling it carefully, so it didn't blind anyone, so it didn't feel like being caught. "Leanne?" she called softly. The shape flinched. Aaliyah stepped forward 2 paces, then stopped, keeping distance. Her voice stayed calm. "It's okay," she said. "You don't have to come closer. You're not in trouble. We're from the community center. Your friend's worried." A face turned toward the light. A teenage girl, wet hair stuck to her cheeks, eyes red, jaw clenched, as if she'd been biting down on sobs for hours. "What do you want?" Leanne snapped, but her voice shook. "We want you out of the rain," Aaliyah replied, "and somewhere with lights. That's it." Leanne laughed once, bitter and small. "Everyone says that," she muttered. "Then they call someone. Then they make it worse." Frank stepped forward without thinking, then caught himself and stopped where Aaliyah stood. His hands were visible, open. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "I used to be the kind of man who made it worse," he said quietly. "I'm not proud of it. I'm trying to be different now. You don't have to trust me. Trust the light. Trust that we're not asking you to walk into a trap." Leanne's eyes narrowed. "Who even are you?" Frank swallowed. "Just a volunteer," he said. "A dad. Someone who knows what it means to mess up and wish you could go back." Aaliyah felt the moment tighten. This was the edge where things could tip into drama, where guilt could turn into a speech, where a teenager could bolt because an adult made it about himself. Aaliyah took over smoothly. "Leanne, we can call someone you choose," she said. "Or we can just drive you to the center. No questions, warm drink, phone charger. You can sit there and decide what you want next. Your friend's there, that's all." Leanne stared at them, chest heaving. Rain ran off her sleeves in thin streams. For a long moment, she looked like she might refuse, out of pure habit. Then her shoulders sagged. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, I'm cold." Aaliyah nodded, relief sharp enough to sting. "Good," she said. "Come toward the light slowly. You're doing fine." Leanne stood shakily, wincing as if her legs had gone numb. She walked toward them in small steps, eyes flicking to the car as if it were a lifeboat. Frank didn't touch her. He didn't crowd her. He simply held his coat open slightly, like a shield from the rain, and said, "You're all right," in a voice that didn't demand belief. Back in the car, heat blasted from the vents. Leanne's hands trembled in her lap. Aaliyah offered her a bottle of water and a pack of tissues without comment. Leanne took them like she was embarrassed to need them. Frank sat in the back seat this time, giving Leanne the front passenger seat so she wouldn't feel boxed in. Aaliyah noticed, and something in her chest shifted, not into forgiveness, not into friendship, but into recognition of a change that wasn't being performed. As they drove back to the community center, Leanne stared out of the window and whispered, "I didn't think anyone would come." Aaliyah kept her eyes on the road. "Someone came," she replied. "That's what matters." At the center, Tasha ran to Leanne so fast, Janine had to remind them gently not to knock each other over. The relief in the room was immediate and physical. Ellie brought hot chocolate with both hands like it was precious. Janine called the police back to update them, and then began the careful work of next steps. Who to contact, what Leanne wanted, what could be done safely tonight, and what had to wait for morning. Frank stood near the door, soaked and quiet, not soaking up praise, not looking around for anyone to clap. Aaliyah watched him for a moment, then walked over. "You did good," she said simply. Frank blinked, eyes wet. "I didn't do anything," he whispered. "You did." Aaliyah shook her head. "You didn't run into the dark. You didn't turn it into your story. You stayed inside the rules. You stayed human. That counts." Frank swallowed hard, then nodded once. "I'll keep counting," he said quietly. "I'll keep doing it." Aaliyah looked through the glass doors at the teens, warming up, laughing shakily now that fear had loosened its grip. She thought of the 12-year-old she had been, standing in rain, believing help was a lottery. She realized closure wasn't a moment where pain vanished. Closure was a pattern breaking. Closure was a girl named Leanne stepping out of the dark because adults stayed steady instead of selfish. Closure was a man named Frank, learning, finally, that the right thing wasn't complicated. It was consistent. And for the first time, when Aaliyah pictured that rainy bus stop from 10 years ago, she didn't only feel the sting of rejection. She also saw the road forward, lit. Frank never got to rewrite the rainy night when he closed his window on a 12-year-old girl, but he did get something harder, the chance to live differently when it mattered. Repeatedly, and without anyone applauding. Aaliyah didn't heal by watching him suffer. She healed by refusing to become the kind of adult who walks away, and by building a life where she stops, listens, and gets people safely home. Ellie learned that love isn't only fear and sacrifice, it's rest, honesty, and letting the adults be the adults. Nadine proved something powerful too. Forgiveness is not owed, but accountability is required, and the past doesn't get erased, it gets faced. And on the night Leanne stepped out of the dark under that underpass, the story delivered its final truth. Real change is what you do when nobody is filming. Frank stayed inside the rules, stayed calm, stayed human, and a girl got out of the rain. Aaliyah finally saw closure for what it really is, not a perfect apology, not a clean ending, but a broken pattern that doesn't get passed on to the next child. What would you have done? Would you have driven away like Frank did back then? Or stopped like Aaliyah did when it counted?